The NFL you know today, billion-dollar stadiums, million-dollar contracts, global audiences. It almost never happened. In fact, the league came within inches of dying in its first 2 decades. Teams folded overnight. Crowds were so small you could count them without taking your shoes off. The Great Depression emptied pockets, and the game itself was brutal enough to end careers in a single hit. But somehow, the NFL survived. And it didn't survive because of marketing or TV deals or luck. It survived because of a small group of legends who played like their lives depended on it. Men who weren't just athletes. They were warriors, showmen, innovators, and in some cases, saviors of the sport itself. This is the untold story of how football refused to die. Imagine being at a football game where the crowd is so small you can hear every word from the sideline, where the players wear leather helmets without face masks, and the ball feels more like a heavy brick than a precision instrument, where a muddy field and freezing wind aren't inconveniences, they're the rule. This was the NFL in its infancy, a fragile experiment on the brink of collapse. From 1920 through the 1930s, pro football faced challenges that should have buried it for good. Entire franchises folded mid-season. Owners ran teams on pocket change. Players were often part-timers, working in steel mills or driving trucks just to feed their families. The Great Depression drained ticket sales. And college football. That was the real show. The NFL was the underdog in its own sport. Yet through it all, a small band of players, coaches, and visionaries refused to let the league die. They didn't just play the game, they built it. Over the next 25 chapters, we'll step into the mud, the blood, and the history that kept football alive. You'll meet George Halas, the man who was more than just a coach. He was a recruiter, promoter, and financier who kept the Chicago Bears and the league itself afloat when nobody else could. You'll run alongside Bronko Nagurski, the human freight train who could flatten an entire defensive line. And Dutch Clarke, the quarterback who turned the T formation into a weapon. We'll bring you the precision of Don Hutson, the wide receiver who invented the modern passing game, and the grace of Jim Thorpe, the all-round athletic legend whose fame made fans pay attention to professional football for the first time. You'll see Mel Eng, the Ironman center who never left the field, and Otto Graham, the quarterback whose winning percentage has never been matched. From the miracle survival of the Green Bay Packers, to the birth of the NFL championship game, to the bizarre college all-star experiments. Every story here is a piece of the puzzle, a reason the NFL didn't vanish into the history books, like so many other failed leagues. And of course, we'll close with Red Grange, the galloping ghost who transformed pro football from a struggling sideshow into a national sensation, proving once and for all that the NFL was here to stay. This isn't just a highlight reel. It's not a list of stats or trivia. This is the story of grit, survival, and vision. The story of how a handful of men, armed with little more than leather helmets, raw talent, and pure determination, carried the NFL through its darkest years. So stick with me, because when you see how close the league came to disappearing, you'll never watch a modern game the same way again. Imagine a world without the NFL. No Super Bowl Sundays, no Monday Night Football, no billion-dollar stadiums roaring with fans. No tailgates, no fantasy leagues, no moments burned into history by a single throw or a single catch. In the early 1930s, that world almost became reality. Teams were collapsing. Stadiums sat empty. The Great Depression had Americans choosing between buying a ticket or buying bread. Even the most loyal fans thought pro football was finished. In some cities, it already was. Franchises that had been around since the league's first days were folding like cheap lawn chairs. But somehow, it didn't die. Against all odds, in the middle of the hardest decade in American history, the NFL clawed its way back from the brink. And what happened next didn't just save the game. It redefined it forever. Today, we're going to tell that story. The one you haven't heard. The one buried beneath decades of Super Bowl highlights and million-dollar endorsements. This is the story of how a sport that almost nobody took seriously went from near extinction to America's greatest game. Back then, professional football wasn't the glamorous must-watch sport you see today. It was the sideshow. College football was king, the Saturday spectacle that packed stadiums and made headlines across the country. If you played in the pros, people thought you were desperate, that you couldn't make it at the college level. Players worked day jobs, steelworkers, factory hands, farmers. They played on weekends for gas money, if they got paid at all. The stadiums were often just muddy fields. The locker rooms, nothing more than drafty sheds. And then came 1929. The stock market crashed, the Great Depression hit, and suddenly, even those meager paydays and small-town crowds started disappearing. Owners were losing money fast. Entire rosters were cut. The league's reputation sank even lower. Fans who once came for the love of the game now stayed home, trying to stretch every penny. By 1932, the NFL had shrunk to just 8 teams. 8. That's all that was left. Cities like Buffalo, Dayton, and Frankfurt had already lost their franchises. Even some of the big-name teams were on shaky ground. Green Bay nearly folded. The Chicago Bears struggled to make payroll. The Portsmouth Spartans were days away from shutting down. The league was, in every sense of the word, dying. And yet, it survived. Over the next 15 chapters, we're going to show you exactly how. The real, gritty, behind-the-scenes survival story of a league that should have disappeared, and the men, fans, and ideas that saved it. We'll begin with the NFL's near-death experience, the moment when the sport hit rock bottom. And even the most die-hard supporters weren't sure it would see another season. Then, we'll move to the 1932 crisis. 8 teams left standing. A look at how Joe Carr, the league's president, managed to keep the ship afloat with desperate measures and hard choices. Well, tell you how Green Bay's miracle, a small-town rescue funded by fans themselves, became the blueprint for community loyalty that still stands today. You'll hear about the 1932 indoor playoff between the Chicago Bears and the Portsmouth Spartans, a snowstorm-forced innovation that showed the NFL could entertain and pave the way for the playoff system. We'll dive into rule changes that saved the game, from legalizing the forward pass from anywhere to moving the goalposts, all designed to make football faster, higher scoring, and more exciting than the slow grind of its early years. You'll see how the Thanksgiving game that went national turned the Detroit Lions into a household name and gave the league one of its greatest traditions. Thanks to the power of nationwide radio, we'll walk you through the birth of the NFL championship game, the first official title match that gave the league its own World Series moment and finally convinced skeptics that pro football mattered. Then there's the College All-Star Game, a bold idea that pitted NFL pros against college's best players. A gamble that paid off with massive crowds and headlines that boosted the league's reputation overnight. We'll look at the great franchise shuffle, when struggling small-market teams relocated to bigger cities, and how that reshaping of the league map created stability. You'll relive the 1934 Sneakers game, an icy championship that turned into a storybook upset and taught the league the value of spectacle and drama in winning fans. We'll see how Burt Bell's 1936 NFL draft stopped the destructive bidding wars for college stars and leveled the playing field for smaller teams, planting the seeds of the NFL's competitive balance. We'll honor the fans who kept the league alive, ordinary people who scraped together pennies to buy tickets, stock shares, and keep their beloved teams from folding. We'll explore how the media slowly fell in love, from tentative radio broadcasts to newsreel footage, laying the foundation for the massive TV deals that would one day define the NFL. We'll take lessons from the brink, where the struggles of the 1930s forced the NFL to grow cautiously, make smart decisions, and never forget its roots. And finally, we'll arrive at from 8 teams to an empire, where the league emerges from its darkest decade armed with the innovations, traditions, and fan loyalty that would one day make it unstoppable. Every chapter will put you on the sidelines and sometimes in the boardrooms, with the people who made decisions that determined whether football lived or died. You'll meet owners like George Halas, who refused to let go of his Bears even when they were losing money hand over fist. Players who worked dangerous factory shifts during the week and then played 60 minutes of brutal, leather helmet football on Sundays. Fans who walked miles to games because they couldn't afford bus fare just to show their support. And through it all, you'll see one undeniable truth. The NFL's survival wasn't inevitable. It was earned, with grit, desperation, and a stubborn refusal to quit. So if you think the NFL was always destined for glory, think again. In the 1930s, it was just one bad season away from disappearing forever. Over the next 15 chapters, you'll learn how that didn't happen, and why every touchdown, every Lombardi trophy, and every Super Bowl halftime show owes its existence to the decade when football refused to die. Because without those years of struggle, without the small-town miracles and the rule-book revolutions, without the fans who refused to walk away, there might be no NFL at all. And when we reach the end of this journey, you just understand how the NFL survived the Great Depression. You'll feel it. You'll know why those years matter just as much as any modern championship. This isn't just football history. This is the survival story of America's game. If you're ready, let's step back into 1930, into the mud, the cold, the empty stands, and a desperate fight to keep a sport alive when the whole world was falling apart. This is how the NFL cheated death. You can almost hear the echo when you look at the standings from 1932. Only 8 teams. That's all that was left of the National Football League, a league that, just a decade earlier, had been bursting with small-town clubs from every corner of the Midwest and Northeast. The Buffalo All-Americans, gone. The Dayton Triangles, gone. The Frankfurt Yellow Jackets, gone. The Providence Steamroller, yes, that was their real name, folded. Even teams that had once been champions were disappearing into history like they'd never existed. The truth was simple. The NFL was shrinking fast, and the owners who remained weren't sure it could survive another year. It all started with the Great Depression's stranglehold on America. When the stock market crashed in 1929, millions of Americans lost their jobs, their savings, and their homes. And when you're struggling to feed your family, a ticket to see a bunch of men in leather helmets slam into each other for 2 hours doesn't exactly feel like a priority. Attendance dropped like a rock. In some cities, the gates barely covered the cost of renting the field. In others, there were more empty seats than paying fans. Owners who had once been able to scrape by on modest profits were suddenly losing thousands every season. And back then, thousands was enough to bankrupt you. The league had no TV contracts, no major sponsorship deals, no billion-dollar safety net. It lived week to week on ticket sales, and when those dried up, so did the teams. By 1932, the situation had gone from bad to desperate. Joe Carr, the NFL's president, had been fighting to hold things together for years. A former minor league baseball executive, Carr was a steady hand, respected for his ability to keep the league organized and somewhat respectable. But even he knew the math was ugly. 20 years earlier, you could get a group of local businessmen together, throw in a few $100s each, and start a football team. By the 1930s, those same businessmen were closing their shops and laying off workers. No one was lining up to finance a failing football franchise, and the remaining 8 teams. They were hanging on by their fingernails. The Chicago Bears, led by George Halas, were one of the few franchises with enough fan support to survive, but even they were cutting costs at every turn. The Chicago Cardinals, the Bears' crosstown rivals, were constantly one bad season away from disappearing. The Green Bay Packers, they'd be bankrupt within a year if something didn't change. The Portsmouth Spartans, based in a small Ohio town, were too good on the field to fold immediately, but to pour off it to last long term. The Boston Braves, Staten Island Stapletons, Brooklyn Dodgers, and New York Giants rounded out the league. None of them had much room for error. The atmosphere was grim. When you talked to owners back then, and reporters did, the question wasn't, how will we grow? It was, will we even exist next season? Players felt it too. Contracts were short-term, often game-to-game. If you got hurt and couldn't play, your paychecks stopped immediately. Some players traveled with the team not knowing if they'd be cut before the next weekend. And without enough teams, the schedule was unstable. Road trips were expensive, so teams stuck to playing local rivals as often as possible. Fans were getting tired of seeing the same matchups again and again. The league was in a death spiral. Fewer teams meant fewer games. Fewer games meant less interest meant fewer ticket sales. And fewer ticket sales meant more teams folding. Joe Carr knew something had to change. Fast. The NFL couldn't just survive on tradition. It needed to make itself relevant, exciting, worth paying for, even when money was tight. And in 1932, by sheer accident, the league got the break it needed. That year's championship race ended in a tie between the Chicago Bears and the Portsmouth Spartans. In most seasons, that would have meant splitting the title. But Carr decided to try something different, a one-game playoff. Then came another problem, the weather. Chicago was buried under snow and ice, making Wrigley Field unplayable. So the Bears and Spartans did something unthinkable. They moved the game indoors to Chicago Stadium. This was the first indoor football game in NFL history. The field had to be shortened to fit, and the rules had to be tweaked, but fans loved it. It was exciting, unpredictable, and drew national attention. That game, which we'll dig into in next fourth segment, would be the first domino in the NFL's revival. But in 1932, it was still just a spark. The league was far from safe. The next few years would require a combination of innovation, luck, and sheer stubbornness from the owners. Coaches and players who refused to let professional football die. But make no mistake, if you were a betting man in 1932, the smart money said the NFL wouldn't last another decade. 8 teams, 8 fragile lifelines, and one wrong move away from extinction. And yet, those 8 teams would carry the league through its darkest days, laying the foundation for everything we know about football today. In third segment, we'll focus on one of those survival stories, the Green Bay Packers, and how a group of ordinary fans pulled off the only small-town miracle in NFL history. Because without them, one of the league's most iconic franchises wouldn't even exist today. Stay with me. When you talk about the NFL's survival in the 1930s, you can't skip Green Bay. In fact, if it weren't for this little Wisconsin town and a group of stubborn, loyal fans, the Packers might have been just another name in the long list of NFL teams that vanished during the Great Depression. Green Bay, in the early 30s, wasn't the football powerhouse you think of today. It was a city of barely 30,000 people, a working-class paper mill town where everybody knew everybody. And Sundays meant one thing: football at City Stadium. But small towns had it rough in the NFL. Big cities like Chicago and New York had larger fan bases, more ticket sales, and more money to keep the lights on. Green Bay, not so much. And during the Great Depression, even those die-hard Packers fans had less and less to spend. In 1933, disaster struck. The Packers lost a lawsuit. A worker asked compensation claim from a fan who D-bend injured at a game. The damages were enough to put the team in serious debt. And remember, this wasn't the modern NFL with billion-dollar owners and TV revenue to bail them out. This was a franchise run on gate receipts, donations, and hope. Within weeks, the word around town was grim. The Packers might fold. The local papers reported the team was insolvent. Other NFL owners whispered that maybe it was time to move the franchise to a bigger city. Green Bay's run in the league seemed like it was about to end, but here's where the story turns. The people of Green Bay refused to let it happen. This wasn't just a football team to them. It was their team. It's a source of pride in a decade when there wasn't much to be proud of. They'd watched Curly Lambeau and his boys win back-to-back NFL championships in 1929, 30, and 31. They'd seen the Packers take on the big city teams and win. So when the call went out for help, the town answered. Curly Lambeau and a group of local businessmen came up with a plan. Sell shares of the team to the public. Not as a typical business investment. These weren't stockholders expecting big profits. This was about ownership in spirit, about giving fans a real stake in keeping the Packers alive. For $5 a share, about $110 today, anyone could become a part owner of the Green Bay Packers. The campaign was bold. Volunteers went door to door. Local shops pitched in by selling shares to customers. Ads ran in the Green Bay Press-Gazette, urging residents to save our Packers. The community rallied like it was a championship game. It worked. Within weeks, hundreds of fans had bought in. The money raised was enough to pay off the debts and keep the franchise afloat. The Packers became, and still are, the only publicly owned team in the NFL. That public ownership model didn't just save Green Bay in 1933. It became a cornerstone of the franchise identity. Today, more than 500,000 people collectively own the team, and no billionaire can swoop in and relocate them. But back in the 1930s, it was about survival. The Packers went back to business, but they still weren't out of the woods. Lambeau knew that even with the debt cleared, they had to win to keep fans engaged. In those days, if your team started losing, attendance would plummet, and so would your bank account. Luckily, Lambeau was a master recruiter. He brought in players like Arnie Herber and Don Hutson, two men who would become legends in the passing game. He built a team that could compete with the best, and more importantly, beat them. Through the rest of the decade, the Packers not only survived, they thrived. They won championships in 1936 and 1939, cementing themselves as a cornerstone of the NFL, even as other franchises folded. The Green Bay Miracle was more than just a feel-good story. It was proof of something the NFL desperately needed in the 1930s, that a deep emotional connection between a team and its community could be strong enough to keep the lights on, even in the darkest times. Other teams took notice. While most couldn't replicate the public ownership model, the NFL eventually banded for new teams. They could learn from the way Green Bay cultivated loyalty. The Packers weren't just selling tickets, they were selling identity. And in a decade where almost everything else was falling apart, that loyalty was priceless. Think about it. A tiny town in Wisconsin saved its NFL team at a time when major cities couldn't keep theirs alive. The Portsmouth Spartans would move to Detroit. The Staten Island Stapletons disappeared. The Frankfurt Yellow Jackets, once champions, were gone forever. But Green Bay dug in, fought back, and proved that small-town football could stand shoulder to shoulder with big city franchises. Today, when you see Lambeau Field packed with fans wearing green and gold, waving foam cheese wedges, and braving freezing temperatures, you're looking at the legacy of that 1933 rescue. Without it, the Packers wouldn't exist, and the NFL might have lost one of its most passionate fan bases forever. We're going to step into a different kind of survival story, one where the NFL got its first real taste of show business. It started with a snowstorm, a tight season, and a game that had to be moved indoors. The year was 1932. The Chicago Bears and the Portsmouth Spartans were about to make history in the first indoor NFL playoff game. And as you'll see, that single event would change the league forever. Stay with me. By the end of the 1932 NFL season, the league was holding on by a thread. Teams were folding. Owners were broke. The future was shaky at best. And yet, in one of the coldest Decembers Chicago had seen in years, The NFL was about to stage an experiment that would transform professional football forever. This is the story of the Bears, the Spartans, a snowstorm, and a game that wouldn't just crown a champion. It would change the way the NFL thought about the sport. The setup was simple. That year, the NFL didn't have playoffs like we know them today. The team with the best regular season record was simply declared champion. No drama, no tiebreakers, no final showdown. But in 1932, the Chicago Bears and the Portsmouth Spartans finished the season tied for first place. Both teams were 6-1. Technically, the title could have been split. They could have called it a draw and gone home. But that didn't sit right with Bears owner-coach George Halas or Portsmouth coach Patsy Clarke. They wanted a winner. They wanted a real championship game. So, for the first time in NFL history, the league decided to hold a one-game playoff. The plan was to play it at Wrigley Field, the Bears' home turf. But Chicago's winter had other ideas. By game day, the field was buried under snow, frozen solid, and covered in dangerous ice. Playing outside wasn't just unpleasant, it was unsafe. That's when the Bears and Spartans made the bold decision to move the game indoors to Chicago Stadium, an arena better known for hockey and boxing than football. It would be the first indoor game in NFL history. The logistics were insane. Chicago Stadium wasn't big enough for a regulation football field, so the dimensions were shrunk to 80 yards long and 45 yards wide. The end zones were cut in half to just 8 yards deep. The field itself was laid over a wooden floor, covered with dirt and a thin layer of sawdust. Fans packed the stands, not just because they wanted to see a championship, but because they were curious. What would football look like indoors? Would it even work? It didn't take long to find out. The game was rough, slow, and low-scoring, but it was electric. Every play felt closer, more immediate. The sound of collisions echoed in the enclosed space. Fans were right on top of the action. For most of the game, the score stayed 0-0. Then, in the fourth quarter, Bears fullback Bronko Nagurski dropped back to pass, something fullbacks almost never did. The Spartans' defense closed in, so Nagurski took a few steps forward, faking a run. Then, just before crossing the line of scrimmage, he tossed the ball into the end zone to Red Grange for the game's first touchdown. Portsmouth protested, claiming Nagurski had crossed the line before throwing, but the officials let it stand. The Bears tacked on a safety and won the game 9-0, becoming the first ever NFL playoff champions. But the real story wasn't the score. It was the crowd reaction. The fans loved it. They loved the one-game, winner-take-all format. They loved the tighter field, the drama of every possession, and the energy of the indoor atmosphere. The newspapers the next day called it the greatest football experiment ever attempted. And while the NFL didn't move all its games indoors, the owners took note. The 1932 indoor playoff directly led to one of the most important changes in league history: the creation of the official NFL playoff system in 1933. From then on, instead of simply declaring the best record as champion, the league was split into divisions, with the winners meeting for the title. That single decision injected drama into the NFL calendar. It gave fans something to look forward to beyond the regular season. It created moments, upsets, comebacks, heroics that would become part of NFL lore. And it all started because of a snowstorm and a willingness to try something new. There's another angle here that's worth mentioning. The Portsmouth Spartans, the team that lost that game, wouldn't be around much longer in their small Ohio town. The financial pressures of the Depression were too great. But the excitement they brought to that championship matchup proved that small-town teams could compete with the big boys, even if they couldn't always survive off the field. In 1934, the Spartans would relocate to Detroit and become the Lions, a franchise that still plays today. So, in a way, the 1932 game didn't just birth the playoff system. It helped birth one of the NFL's enduring teams: the 1932 indoor Playoff is a perfect example of something the NFL has done better than most leagues throughout its history. Adapt. When the situation changes, the league finds a way to keep fans engaged. That lesson, learned in the middle of the Depression, would help the NFL not just survive the 1930s, but eventually dominate American sports. It's easy to look back now and see it as inevitable. But in that moment, it was a gamble, a desperate attempt to salvage a season and crown a champion in front of paying customers. And that gamble paid off in a way no one could have predicted. In Batch 5, we are going to talk about the other big factor that kept the NFL alive: rule changes. Because in the early 1930s, football was still stuck in its grinded-out, low-scoring roots. Fans wanted excitement, and the league needed to deliver. From moving the goalposts to making the forward pass more dangerous. The NFL's rulebook was about to get a major facelift, one that would make the game faster, higher scoring, and, most importantly, more fun to watch. And without those changes, the league's story might have ended before it even began. Stay with me. By the early 1930s, the NFL had a serious problem, and it wasn't just the Great Depression or empty stadiums. It was the game itself. Football in those days was slow, grinding, and, frankly, kind of boring to the average fan. Teams relied almost entirely on running plays, smashing into the line over and over for a few yards at a time. Passing was rare, risky, and heavily restricted. And when you combine low-scoring games with freezing weather and ticket prices that most families couldn't afford, you start to see why fans weren't exactly lining up at the gates. The NFL needed more than survival. It needed entertainment. In 1933, fresh off the momentum of the first indoor playoff game, the league's owners gathered for a meeting that would change everything. Their mission? Make the game more exciting, more accessible, and more attractive to paying customers. The result? A series of rule changes that saved the NFL. The first and most important change was to the forward pass. Before 1933, quarterbacks could only throw the ball from at least 5 yards behind the line of scrimmage. That meant passing plays took longer to develop and were easier for defenses to stop. In 33, the league eliminated that restriction. Now, you could throw from anywhere behind the line. This opened up the passing game, allowing quicker throws, creative formations, and more dynamic offense. Suddenly, teams could surprise defenses with short, sharp passes or attack downfield without risking a penalty. Another major change: hash marks. Before 1933, the ball was placed where the previous play ended, even if that meant it was right up against the sideline. This made passing nearly impossible in some situations and limited play calling. The league introduced inbounds lines, hash marks, moving the ball toward the center of the field after each play. This gave offenses more room to operate, balanced the game, and kept the action more exciting for fans. Then came goalpost relocation. At the time, goalposts were at the back of the end zone, making field goals harder to hit. In 1933, the NFL moved them to the goal line, making kicks more frequent and giving fans more scoring to cheer for. They'd be moved back again in 1974. But for decades, this change kept games more competitive and points on the board. The league also introduced division play that year, splitting the teams into Eastern and Western divisions. The winners would meet in an official championship game, a direct result of the buzz from the 1932 indoor playoff. For the first time, fans had a season-long race to follow and a guaranteed showdown at the end. And there were smaller tweaks that made a big difference. The NFL began allowing passes to be caught in the end zone previously. The ball had to cross the goal line before being caught. They adjusted the penalty rules, introduced changes to the way fumbles were handled, and even tweaked the game ball itself to make passing easier. Each change was designed with one thing in mind: keep the fans coming back. The results were immediate. In the 1933 season, scoring increased. Passing yards went up. The new championship game, Bears vs. Giants, was a hit. with the Giants using trick plays and laterals that wowed the crowd. The NFL suddenly felt less like a grind and more like a show. And that's exactly what it needed to be. Here's the thing about those changes. They weren't just about aesthetics. They were about survival strategy. The League S leaders understood that pro football wasn't a tradition yet, it was a product they were selling. And if that product wasn't exciting, people wouldn't buy it. This is where the NFL pulled ahead of college football in terms of adaptability. College rules were slower to change, bound by tradition and bureaucracy. The NFL could innovate on the fly, and that flexibility kept it alive through the Depression. One of the big winners from these changes was the passing game itself. Before 1933, the forward pass was more of a desperation move than a strategy. After the rule changes, players like Arnie Herber, Dutch Clarke, and later Sammy Baugh would turn passing into an art form. Fans started coming to games to see big plays, not just pile-ups at the line of scrimmage. By making the game more open and faster-paced, the NFL planted the seeds for the modern aerial attacks we see today. The 1933 rule changes also marked a cultural shift. The league was no longer just imitating college football. It was building its own identity. The NFL's version of the game was different, flashier, more unpredictable, and better suited for professional entertainment. This mattered because, in the eyes of many fans at the time, college football was the real sport. Pro football was something you played after college if you needed the money. The 1933 season started to change that perception, and it worked. By the mid-1930s, attendance was climbing again. Newspapers were devoting more coverage to pro games. Radio broadcasts were reaching more ears. The NFL wasn't thriving, yet far from it. But it was no longer on life support. These rule changes didn't just keep the league alive, they gave it a future. In the next segment, we'll see how one of those new traditions, the Thanksgiving Day game, helped the NFL expand its reach nationwide. Because in 1934, a struggling team in a struggling city came up with an idea. What if we turned a holiday into a football spectacle? That gamble would put the Detroit Lions on the map, introduce millions of Americans to pro football, and give the league one of its most enduring traditions. And it all started as a desperate marketing stunt. Stay tuned. By 1934, the NFL was still fighting for its life. Yes, the 1933 rule changes had brought a spark. Yes, the playoff system was new and exciting. But the league still had a visibility problem. Outside of a few hot spots like Chicago, New York, and Green Bay, most Americans didn't even know when NFL games were happening or why they should care. College football still dominated the headlines. That's when one man in Detroit decided to change everything. His name was George A. Richards. He wasn't a football coach. He wasn't even a player. Richards was a businessman, and more importantly, a radio station owner. He had just bought the Portsmouth Spartans, a financially doomed small-town team, and moved them to Detroit, rebranding them as the Detroit Lions. But there was a problem. Detroit already had a football team. The University of Detroit. Titans and college football ruled the city. The Lions needed attention, and they needed it fast. Richards had an idea. Turn Thanksgiving Day into a national stage for the NFL. Now, football on Thanksgiving wasn't new. High schools and colleges had been playing Turkey Day games for decades. But no NFL team had tried to make it a centerpiece event. Richards saw an opening. He scheduled the Lions to play the Chicago Bears on Thanksgiving Day. 1934. The Bears were the defending NFL champions, loaded with stars like Bronko Nagurski and Red Grange. If you wanted to draw a crowd in Detroit, this was the matchup. But Richards didn't stop there. He pulled out his secret weapon: radio. Richards owned WJR Radio in Detroit, a major CBS affiliate. He struck a deal to broadcast the game nationwide over the entire CBS radio network. Suddenly, this wasn't just a Detroit game. It was a coast-to-coast event. For many Americans, it would be the first time they'd ever hear an NFL game live. The buildup was huge. Newspapers ran ads for the game. The radio promos ran for weeks. And on Thanksgiving morning, the Lions University of Detroit Stadium was packed with more than 26,000 fans. A sellout crowd. Across the country, families tuned in while carving their turkeys. Hearing the sounds of leather helmets crashing and crowds roaring in real time, the game itself. A classic. The Bears came in undefeated, and the Lions, led by quarterback Dutch Clarke, fought them every step of the way. Detroit jumped out to a 16-7 lead at halftime, electrifying the home crowd. But in the second half, the Bears roared back, scoring twice to win 19-16 and remain perfect on the season. The Lions lost the game, but they won something far more important: national attention. The Thanksgiving game was such a success that Richards and the Lions made it an annual tradition. For decades, the Lions would host the only NFL game played on Thanksgiving, giving them guaranteed national coverage every year. And for the league, it was gold. Think about what this did for the NFL in the 1930s. It created a holiday tradition that built brand loyalty. Families started associating pro football with Thanksgiving, the same way they associated parades and pumpkin pie. It put the league on a national broadcast every year, crucial in an era before TV when radio was king. And it proved that the NFL could own a day on the calendar. That marketing playbook would be used again decades later with events like Monday Night Football and the Super Bowl. It also showed the power of partnerships. The Lions' relationship with CBS helped the NFL realize just how big the audience could be beyond the stadium walls. This was more than just a game. It was content, and content could be sold, promoted, and broadcast to millions. In many ways, the Thanksgiving game was the league's first real taste of the national spotlight. And once they had it, they never looked back. The tradition grew so strong that even during World War II, when travel and rosters were restricted, the Lions kept playing on Thanksgiving. In 1966, the Dallas Cowboys joined the tradition with their own Thanksgiving game, giving the holiday a doubleheader that continues today. But it all started in 1934 with one owner's gamble to turn a regular season game into a national event. And here's the bigger picture. In the depths of the Great Depression, the NFL couldn't outspend or outshine college football. But it could be smarter. By creating unique events, by owning a holiday, by making themselves part of the American calendar, the league made sure it stayed relevant and stayed alive. George Richards may not have been a football genius, but he was a marketing genius. And in the 1930s, marketing might have been even more important than winning. In the next segment 7, we're going to shift from marketing to prestige. Because the very next year, the NFL took another bold step, creating a World Series of football. It was called the NFL Championship Game, and it would become the league's crown jewel. We'll talk about the first title game, why it mattered, and how it turned pro football from a ragtag league into a legitimate national sport. Stay tuned. By the mid-1930s, the NFL had survived the near-death spiral of the Depression, the 18 crisis, and the constant folding of franchises. It wasn't thriving, not yet, but it was breathing. And breathing was enough to dream, just a little bigger. The Thanksgiving game had proven one thing. Fans loved spectacle. They loved a big, can't-miss event, something that made a game feel more important than just another Sunday. So, in 1933, the league decided to try something radical. Something that would not only boost attendance, but also cement the NFL as a legitimate professional sport worth following from start to finish. The idea was simple: an official championship game, the pro football version of baseball's World Series. Until then, the NFL had crowned its champion based purely on the regular season standings. Whoever had the best record at the end of the year took home the title. If there was a tie, like in 1932, things got awkward. That indoor playoff game between the Bears and the Portsmouth Spartans was fun, sure, but it wasn't part of an official system. Fans wanted more drama, and owners wanted more revenue. So at the league meeting before the 1933 season, NFL President Joe Carr announced a major change. The league would be split into two divisions, Eastern and Western. At the end of the season, the division winners would meet in a championship game to decide the NFL's true champion. It didn't take long for the new format to deliver exactly what the league hoped for. In the Eastern Division, the New York Giants, coached by Steve Owen, fought their way to the top with 11-3 record. In the Western Division, George Halas's Chicago Bears dominated with a perfect 10-2 season. The stage was set. The Bears versus the Giants, East versus West. The very first official NFL championship game. On December 17, 1933, the two teams met at Wrigley Field in Chicago. The weather was freezing, typical for a Midwest December, but the stands were packed with over 25,000 fans. This wasn't just another game. The newspapers hyped it for weeks. The radio broadcast carried it to thousands more. This was the NFL's first true event game, and everyone knew it. From the opening whistle, it delivered. The Giants struck first with a trick play, a hidden ball run that fooled the Bears' defense. Chicago answered with power runs from Bronko Nagurski and quick passes from quarterback Carl Brumbaugh. Then came the play that would go down in history. In the second quarter, Nagurski dropped back to pass. But instead of throwing directly to a receiver, he faked a run, then lobbed the ball to Earl Dutch Clarke, who tossed it forward again to Bill Hewitt, who then lateraled to Bill Carr for a touchdown. It was chaos. It was creative. It was exactly what the league wanted. A reason for fans to leave the stadium buzzing. The game stayed tight until the final minutes, when the Bears sealed the win with another touchdown, taking the first NFL championship game 23-21. The crowd went wild. The owners went home smiling. And the league had just found a new tradition that would shape its future. Here's why this mattered so much. First, it gave the NFL a narrative. Instead of a season just fading out in December, there was now a climax, a high-stakes battle where everything was on the line. Second, it gave the league more money. Championship games meant higher ticket prices, bigger crowds, and more media coverage. Even in the middle of the Depression, people would pay to see the best of the best go head-to-head. Third, it gave players a reason to push harder. A championship meant glory, and in a league still fighting for legitimacy, glory was everything. Over the years, the NFL championship game would grow into one of the biggest annual events in sports. In 1967, it evolved into what we now know as the Super Bowl. But in 1933, it was just a gamble that worked. That first title game proved that professional football could create moments just as thrilling, just as memorable as anything in college football. And maybe, just maybe, it could win the hearts of fans across the country. But there's something else here, something deeper. The 1933 championship wasn't just about the teams on the field. It was about the league learning that presentation mattered. It wasn't enough to have talented players. You had to put them in situations that felt larger than life. That was the magic of the championship game. It took a sport that was struggling to find its identity and gave it a crown. A goal. A reason for fans to stick around until the very end. In the next segment, we're going to look at another bold experiment from the 1930s, one that pitted the pros against the college stars in a spectacle that drew massive crowds and headlines. It was called the College All-Star Game, and it was part competition, part publicity stunt, but it worked. For a league desperate for attention, it was one more step toward survival. Stay with me. By the mid-1930s, the NFL had its championship game. It had rule changes to make the sport faster and more exciting. It had holiday traditions like the Thanksgiving Day game in Detroit. But there was still one giant problem: public perception. Even with all the changes, many sports fans in America still thought professional football was second-rate compared to the college game. College football had the big crowds, the pageantry, the marching bands, and campus rivalries that spanned generations. If you told someone you played in the NFL, they might still look at you like you de-stepped down a level from real football. The league needed a way to prove, once and for all, that pro players weren't just as good as college stars. They were better. That's where the idea for the College All-Star Game came from. It was 1934, and a sports writer named Arch Ward, the same man who had helped create baseball's All-Star Game, had an idea. What if, at the end of every summer, you took the reigning NFL champions and had them play a hand-picked team of the best college seniors from around the country? Not an exhibition against some random club team. Not a scrimmage. A full game, pro versus amateur. Men who had already proven themselves against men who were about to enter the league. It was a brilliant piece of marketing. For college fans, it was a chance to see their school heroes one more time before they moved on. For NFL fans, it was a chance to prove the pros were the best of the best. And for the league, it was priceless publicity. The first game was set for August 31st, 1934, at Soldier Field in Chicago, a massive stadium that could seat over 100,000 people. The matchup, the NFL champion Chicago Bears against the best college players in the country, chosen through a combination of fan voting and expert selection. The all-star roster read like a who's who of the nation's top talent, many of whom would go on to NFL careers. The hype was unbelievable. Newspapers across the country ran full-page features. Fans debated in barbershops and taverns. Could the college kids pull off the upset? When game day came, more than 79,000 fans packed Soldier Field, a record crowd for a pro football game at the time. Millions more listened on the radio. And then, the game ended in a 0-0 tie. Yup. No touchdowns, no field goals, just a defensive slugfest played in the pouring rain. Some called it anticlimactic. But here, as the thing, the game itself didn't matter as much as the fact that it happened. The College All-Star Game instantly became an annual tradition. Every year from 1934 to 1976, the reigning NFL champions would take on the College All-Stars in Chicago. And while the pros usually won, as they should, the games were often competitive. In 1937, the college kids actually beat the NFL champion Green Bay Packers, 6-0. Those rare upsets kept fans interested, but the long-term effect was clear. The more people saw the pros go toe-to-toe with the nation's best young players, the more they respected the NFL. For the league, the College All-Star Game was a goldmine of goodwill. It put the NFL's top team on national display before the regular season even began. It gave rookies a taste of professional competition, and it blurred the line between the college and pro games in a way that helped the NFL start stealing fans from the Saturday crowd. It also cemented the NFL's relationship with Chicago, which had already been a crucial market for the league. Soldier Field became the unofficial home of this showcase, and the city's sports fans embraced it like it was their own. And while the game would eventually fade away in the late 1970s, mostly because NFL teams didn't want their stars risking injury in a preseason exhibition, its legacy in the 1930s and 40s was massive. Here's what it really proved. The NFL could create events, not just games, but spectacles that drew national attention. The championship game, the Thanksgiving tradition, and now a summer showdown between pros and amateurs. In an era when the league was still fragile, these events gave it identity, relevance, and an annual rhythm that kept fans engaged year-round. In the next segment, we're going to dive into the man who was quietly pulling the strings through much of this. NFL President Joe Carr. Carr wasn't flashy. He wasn't a player or coach. But in the 1930s, his leadership kept the league from falling apart. And his vision set the stage for the NFL's future dominance. Without him, there's a good chance the league would have folded before World War II, and his story might just be the most important one in this whole saga. Stay with me. When you think of the NFL's early years, certain names jump out. George Halas, Curly Lambeau, Red Grange. They were the stars, the coaches, the faces in the photographs. But behind the scenes, there was a man most fans didn't even know existed. And yet, without him, the league probably wouldn't have survived the 1930s at all. His name was Joe Carr. And if the NFL were a house, he was the one holding up the beams when the walls were falling apart. Carr wasn't a flashy sports figure. He wasn't a player. He wasn't a former coach. He started as a sports writer in Columbus, Ohio, and later ran the Columbus Panhandles, one of the NFL's original teams. When the league, then called the American Professional Football Association, was founded in 1920, Carr wasn't even the first president. That role went to Jim Thorpe, more as a publicity stunt than as an executive decision. But by 1921, the league realized it needed someone who could actually run it. Someone organized. Someone who could give the chaotic, traveling circus nature of early pro football some kind of structure. They turned to Carr. By the time the 1930s rolled around, Carr had been president for nearly a decade, and his fingerprints were everywhere. First, he brought order to the schedule. Before Carr, teams made their own schedules, often double-booking games or canceling on short notice. Carr created a standardized schedule that gave fans consistency and made sure the league's title race was fair. Second, he cleaned up the game's image. In the 1920s, pro football was seen as a brutal, almost lawless sport. Players sometimes jumped from team to team in the same season. Rules were loose, officiating was inconsistent, and fights often broke out on the field. Carr introduced stricter officiating standards, mandatory contracts, and rules to prevent players from moonlighting for other teams. He also worked to improve the conduct of players and coaches, making the NFL a more respectable product in the eyes of the public. Third, and maybe most importantly during the Depression, Carr kept the league financially lean. He understood that the NFL couldn't survive with bloated rosters or unnecessary expenses. He encouraged teams to operate within their means. And when a franchise couldn't sustain itself, he didn't hesitate to shut it down or move it. It sounds harsh, but that's why the league survived. He was willing to make tough cuts. Carr also had a talent for finding the right markets. He knew small towns like Portsmouth and Pottsville couldn't sustain teams forever, no matter how passionate the local fans were. At the same time, he recognized the importance of keeping certain community-rooted franchises, like Green Bay, because they gave the league character and loyal fan bases. It was a balancing act, and Carr played it well. Another key move: embracing innovation. Carr wasn't afraid to tweak the rules to make the game more exciting, which is why he supported the forward pass reforms of 1933, the introduction of hash marks, and the creation of the championship game. He also understood the importance of media. Even before television existed, he worked with newspapers and radio to promote the NFL's stars and storylines. In an age when college football owned the headlines, Carr made sure the pros had a seat at the table. But perhaps his greatest contribution was stability. In the 1930s, the NFL could easily have collapsed into a patchwork of barnstorming teams and failed leagues, like so many other pro sports experiments of the time. Carr's leadership kept the league united. Even when franchises folded, the league itself stayed intact. And that gave the NFL something incredibly valuable: time. Time to grow, time to adapt, and time to outlast its competition. Carr wasn't perfect. Some criticized him for being too cautious, too focused on survival over expansion. Others felt he didn't market the league aggressively enough in the booming big cities. But history is clear on one thing: without his steady hand, the NFL might not have been around long enough for the television era, the Super Bowl, or the billion-dollar empire it would eventually become. Joe Carr served as NFL president until his death in 1939. By then, the league was far from secure, but it was established. It had rules, structure, traditions, and a foundation strong enough to weather the storms ahead. When the NFL created its Hall of Fame in 1963, Carr was among the first inductees, not because fans remembered his touchdowns. He never scored any, but because he was the reason. The league had survived long enough for fans to care about touchdowns at all. In Batch 10, we're going to step back into the action and into one of the most dramatic, snow-filled games of the decade. It was 1934. The New York Giants were facing the Chicago Bears in the championship game. The Bears were undefeated. The field was frozen solid. And what happened next would go down in NFL history as the sneakers game. It's a story about strategy, survival, and how a borrowed pair of shoes helped take down one of the greatest teams of the era. Stay tuned. It's December 9th, 1934. New York City is locked in winter's grip. The Polo Grounds, home of the New York Giants, looks more like an ice rink than a football field. The stakes couldn't be higher. The undefeated Chicago Bears, minus 13 wins, no losses, are here to claim another NFL championship. They're the league's powerhouse, led by legends like Bronko Nagurski and Red Grange. They've beaten the Giants twice already this season. Most people in the stands expect this game to be more of the same. But what they're about to see will go down as one of the strangest and most legendary moments in NFL history. The field that day was a disaster. A freezing rain the night before had turned the turf into a sheet of ice. Players were slipping just walking to the huddle. Cleats, which were supposed to dig into the ground, might as well have been skates. From the opening whistle, the Bears looked unstoppable. They played their bruising, run-heavy game and jumped out to a 13-3 lead by the third quarter. Every time the Giants tried to mount a drive, they slipped, stumbled, and lost their footing. Chicago's defenders weren't just stopping plays. They were knocking New York players straight onto the frozen ground. It felt inevitable. The Bears were going to finish the season undefeated and cement themselves as one of the most dominant teams in NFL history. And then, the sneakers happened. At halftime, Giants player coach Steve Owen knew something had to change. He remembered that the Manhattan college basketball team kept a stock of sneakers, shoes with soft rubber soles, that might grip the icy field better than cleats. So, Owen sent an assistant coach sprinting to borrow them. By the start of the fourth quarter, several Giants players had swapped their cleats for the borrowed basketball shoes. They looked ridiculous, wearing high-top canvas sneakers in a championship football game. But suddenly, they could cut, pivot, and stay upright while the Bears kept sliding. The shift was immediate and dramatic. Giants quarterback Ed Danowski started finding open receivers. Running back Ken Strong, wearing sneakers, began slicing through the Bears' defense. Chicago defenders lunged and missed, their cleats skidding on the ice. In the final quarter alone, the Giants scored 27 points, completely flipping the game on its head. What had looked like a sure Bears victory turned into a stunning 30-13 Giants win. The crowd went wild. The newspapers the next day called it the sneakers game, and it's still remembered as one of the greatest upsets in NFL history. But the game wasn't just a fun piece of trivia. It mattered a lot. The Bears' loss ended what could have been one of the NFL's rare perfect seasons. It also gave the Giants a championship that boosted their credibility as one of the league's premier franchises. For the league itself, the sneakers game became a story they could sell, a narrative about strategy, innovation, and the idea that no game is ever truly over. It also showed that conditions, weather, field, even footwear, could completely change the course of a football game. And in the 1930s, that unpredictability was part of the sport's charm. The Giants' use of sneakers wasn't cheating. There were no rules about footwear, and other teams quickly learned the lesson: adapt to conditions or get left behind. In fact, Over the years, several other NFL teams would break out sneakers in icy games, always with a nod to the Giants' 1934 miracle. But maybe the most important thing about the sneakers game is what it said about the NFL's identity in the 1930s. The league was still a scrappy underdog in the American sports landscape, constantly having to prove it could produce moments worth watching. The Giants' dramatic comeback against an undefeated powerhouse was the perfect example of why pro football was worth the ticket. It wasn't just brute force. It was quick thinking, creativity, and the thrill of seeing the impossible happen right in front of you. Ken Strong, the Giants star that day, later summed it up perfectly. "We just had better shoes." But of course, it was more than that. It was about seizing opportunity when it appeared, even if that opportunity came in the form of a dusty pile of basketball sneakers. In Batch 11, we all step away from a single game and look at a growing trend in the late 1930s. The emergence of individual NFL superstars. Up until now, football had been about teams, not personalities. But as the league entered its next phase, certain players began to shine so brightly that they drew fans all by themselves. And in a league still fighting for national relevance, those star players were worth their weight in gold. Stay tuned. By the late 1930s, the NFL had found its footing. The league had a championship game, Thanksgiving traditions, and stories like the sneakers game that captured imaginations. But it still had one major challenge: selling the sport to the average American who didn't have a local team to root for. The answer? Superstars. Before the 30s, professional football was mostly about the team, not the individual. Fans might know the name of their local quarterback or coach, but nationally, there were no Babe Ruths of football. No single player who could draw a crowd just by showing up. That began to change in the 1930s as certain players started to transcend the game. These weren't just good athletes, they were marketable. They had styles, stories, and personalities that fans could latch onto. And for a sport still fighting for survival, that kind of star power was gold. Take Bronko Nagurski, for example. A farm boy from Minnesota, Nagurski was built like a human bulldozer, minus 6'2", 235 pounds, which was enormous for the era. On the field, he was a nightmare for defenders, plowing through tackles like they were tissue paper. Off the field, he had a quiet, humble demeanor that made him easy to root for. Fans didn't just watch Nagurski play football. They told stories about him, about how he once ran through a goalpost by accident, about how he could carry multiple defenders on his back. Whether those stories were exaggerated didn't matter. They turned him into a living legend. Then there was Red Grange, the galloping ghost. Grange had already been a star in the 1920s, thanks to his college career at Illinois. But by the 1930s, he was helping give the NFL legitimacy. He wasn't just a player. He was a show. Whenever he played, attendance jumped. His presence alone could turn a small market game into a sellout. Grange's speed, agility, and knack for big plays made him one of the first players whose style could be described as must-see. The league also saw stars emerging at other positions. Dutch Clarke became the face of the Detroit Lions in the mid-30s. A triple-threat quarterback who could run, pass, and kick. Clarke was known for his precision and leadership. Fans loved watching him because he seemed like he could do it all. Then there was Clarke Hinkle of the Green Bay Packers. A fullback whose toughness and relentless drive made him one of the league's most respected players. And Mel Lang, the Ironman center for the New York Giants, who played 60 minutes a game, week after week, without substitutions, a feat that's almost unthinkable in modern football. These players became the NFL's first real celebrities. Newspapers began running player profiles and human interest stories, not just box scores. Fans started collecting autographs and keeping scrapbooks. Kids pretended to be Nagurski or Clarke in Sandlot games. And perhaps most importantly, these stars became ambassadors for the league. When they traveled for games, they did interviews, posed for photos, and met with local reporters. They weren't just playing football. They were selling the NFL to the country. The emergence of superstars also changed how the game was played. Coaches began designing plays around their star players' strengths. Fans would come to see Nagurski power through the line or Clarke execute a perfect dropkick. And when those players delivered, it created moments people talked about for weeks. It was no longer enough to just win. You had to put on a show. The NFL began leaning into this. Programs and promotional materials featured players' faces more prominently. Ticket sales campaigns highlighted matchups between stars. The league realized it could market personalities just as much as teams. It worked. Attendance in the late 30s began to climb steadily, even as the country was still recovering from the Great Depression. Radio broadcasts started mentioning player stats and records, giving fans more to follow and debate. And here's the thing. These stars didn't just help sell tickets in their own cities. They drew national attention. When Nagurski or Grange played in your town, it was an event. People came from miles away, not because they cared about the Bears or Giants, but because they wanted to see greatness. That's when the NFL began to understand that star power could transcend local loyalty. Of course, these players weren't making the kind of money modern stars do. Most of them had off-season jobs, farming, teaching, selling insurance. But during the fall, they were heroes. And for a league still clawing for respect, that was enough. By the end of the decade, the NFL had a handful of names every football fan knew, and a growing number of casual fans who could recognize them too. That recognition mattered. Because in the 1940s, when the league would face new challenges, including war, player shortages, and rival leagues, it would be the loyalty to these stars that kept fans coming back. In the next segment, we go into focus on one of those stars who didn't just dominate the field, but also changed how the game was played. Sammy Baugh. Baugh wasn't just a quarterback. He was the man who proved the forward pass could be the centerpiece of an offense. And in doing so, he helped shape the modern NFL. Stay tuned. By the mid-1930s, football was still a run-first, smash-mouth game. Yes, the forward pass was legal, but it was more of a trick play, something you pulled out on 3rd and long when nothing else worked. Quarterbacks weren't expected to win games with their arms. They were just another back in the backfield. Passing was dangerous, risky, and in most coaches' minds, a last resort. And then came Sammy Baugh. Samuel Adrian Baugh was born in 1914 in Temple, Texas, and grew up on a farm. He wasn't the biggest kid, but he had an arm like a whip and the kind of accuracy that made him deadly in baseball. In fact, Baugh's first love was baseball. He was a star third baseman and even got a minor league contract with the St. Louis Cardinals. But football had another plan for him. Baugh went to Texas Christian University, where his passing ability made him a national sensation. At TCU, he turned the forward pass from a desperation play into a weapon. His deep throws weren't just strong, they were precise. Receivers didn't have to adjust. The ball found them in stride. By the time he graduated in 1937, he was already being called the best passer in college football history. The NFL took notice. That year, the Washington Redskins made him their first-round draft pick, and the league would never be the same. Baugh's rookie season was a revelation. He didn't just throw occasionally, he threw constantly by the standards of the time. He finished 1937 with 1,127 passing yards, leading the league. And in the championship game against the Chicago Bears, he threw for 3 touchdowns to give Washington the title. In an era when running backs were the stars, Baugh had just shown that a quarterback could take over a game with his arm. But here's the thing about Sammy Baugh. He wasn't just a quarterback. He also played defensive back and was one of the best punters the game has ever seen. In 1943, he led the league in passing, punting, and interceptions, a triple crown of football that will almost certainly never be repeated. His punts were legendary, often traveling over 70 yards in the air. On defense, his instincts made him a nightmare for opposing quarterbacks. And on offense, he was redefining what was possible. Baugh's style was different from anyone else's. While most quarterbacks of the time would stand upright and throw from the pocket, Baugh would drop low, sidearm the ball, or fire quick strikes before the defense could react. He was creative, fearless, and confident enough to try throws other quarterbacks wouldn't even consider. And because of him, the passing game became something coaches started building offenses around. One of his most famous games came in 1943, against the Detroit Lions. Baugh completed 16 of 21 passes for 376 yards and 6 touchdowns, numbers that were unheard of at the time. To put it in perspective, some teams didn't throw for that many yards in an entire season back then. He also holds one of the strangest records in NFL history. In a single game, he threw 4 touchdown passes, and also intercepted 4 passes while playing defense. But Baugh's greatness wasn't just about stats, it was about influence. Before Baugh, the NFL was still trying to figure out what kind of game it wanted to be. Was it a ground-and-pound battle of willpower? Or could it be something faster, flashier, more exciting? Baugh answered that question every Sunday. He showed that passing could be just as thrilling as a long run, maybe even more so. By the time he retired in 1952, Baugh had set 13 NFL records, many of which stood for decades. He had led the league in passing 6 times, was a 2-time NFL champion, and was the first quarterback to truly be considered the face of a franchise. Off the field, Baugh was a quiet man who preferred ranch life to the spotlight. He wasn't a showman like some modern quarterbacks, but on the field, he played with a swagger that made him the most feared passer of his era. When the Pro Football Hall of Fame opened in 1963, Sammy Baugh was part of its inaugural class. Fitting, considering that without him, the modern quarterback position might look completely different. Baugh's career bridged 2 eras: the rough-and-tumble, run-heavy 1930s and the more balanced, pass-friendly 1940s and 50s. His success proved that a great passing game could win championships. And that realization changed how coaches drafted, trained, and called plays forever. In the NFL's survival story, Sammy Baugh wasn't just a star, he was a turning point. In the next segment, we were going to step away from quarterbacks and look at a player whose dominance came from pure, relentless toughness: Clarke Hinkle. Hinkle was a fullback, a linebacker, and one of the toughest men to ever put on pads. His clashes with Bronko Nagurski became the stuff of legend, and his career embodies the grit and grind of 1930s football. Stay tuned. If Sammy Baugh was the master of finesse, then Clarke Hinkle was the master of force. No flash, no trickery, just raw power, grit, and a willingness to hit you again and again until you didn't want to get up. In an era when football was as much about survival as it was about winning, Clarke Hinkle was one of the toughest players ever to step onto an NFL field. Born in 1909 in Toronto, Ohio, Hinkle didn't grow up dreaming about football fame. He learned toughness the old-fashioned way, by working hard and playing hard in small-town America. He played college ball at Bucknell University, where he became a standout at both fullback and linebacker. His versatility and relentless motor caught the attention of the Green Bay Packers, who signed him in 1932. That would be the start of a 10-year career that turned him into one of the league's most respected and feared players. Hinkle wasn't the biggest fullback in the NFL, at 5'11" and around 190 pounds. He was actually considered undersized for the position. But what he lacked in size, he made up for with sheer determination. On offense, he was a punishing runner who seemed to invite contact. On defense, he was a linebacker who hit with the same power he ran with. And in those days, remember, there were no specialists. If you were on the roster, you played both ways. That meant Hinkle was on the field almost every minute of every game. His most famous battles were against Bronko Nagurski of the Chicago Bears. If you've ever heard stories about old-school football being like a street fight, the Hinkle-Nagurski clashes are Exhibit A, two of the most physical players in the league, running directly into each other again and again, neither one backing down. Fans would circle those Packers-Bears matchups on the calendar, not just for the rivalry, but to see which man would win the collision war that week. One of the most legendary moments in their rivalry came in 1934. Nagurski had been steamrolling defenses all season, but when he met Hinkle head-on at the line of scrimmage, he went down hard. The crowd erupted. It wasn't just a tackle, it was a statement. From then on, Hinkle's reputation as the NFL's toughest hitter was sealed. But Hinkle was more than just a battering ram. He had speed, balance, and great vision for finding running lanes. He was also an excellent kicker, handling extra points and field goals for the Packers when needed. In 1937, he led the league in rushing yards, proof that his bruising style could also produce big numbers. Hinkle's career was a model of consistency. Year after year, he lined up, took the hits, and kept going. In an era when injuries often ended careers quickly, Hinkle's durability was remarkable. He played through pain that would sideline modern players for weeks. Broken fingers, cracked ribs, bruises that covered half his body. None of it kept him from suiting up. Off the field, Hinkle was known for his modesty. He didn't brag about his toughness or his stats. He just showed up, did his job, and let the results speak for themselves. His teammates respected him. His opponents respected him. Even George Halas, the legendary coach of the Bears, the Packers' fiercest rivals, admitted that Hinkle was one of the best players he'd ever seen. By the time he retired in 1941, Hinkle had rushed for 3,860 yards, caught 49 passes, and scored 44 touchdowns. He was the NFL's all-time leading rusher at the time, a record that stood until 1949. But more than the numbers, 'twas the way he played that left a mark. Hinkle embodied the Ironman spirit of early pro football, when players weren't just athletes, they were warriors. In 1964, Clarke Hinkle was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, cementing his place among the game's greats. Today, Lambeau Field's practice facility is named the Clarke Hinkle Field, a tribute to the man who gave everything for the Green Bay Packers and the NFL, in the grand story of the league's survival. Players like Hinkle were essential. They weren't just stars. They were proof that the NFL had athletes as tough, skilled, and determined as any sport in the country. Hinkle didn't save the league with one play or one game. He saved it with a decade of showing fans what professional football looked like at its most relentless. In the next segment, we're going to turn the spotlight on another barrier breaker from the 1930s, Fritz Pollard. Pollard wasn't just a great player and coach. He was the NFL's first black head coach, a pioneer who fought battles on and off the field to open doors for future generations. Stay tuned. If Clarke Hinkle was a symbol of toughness, Fritz Pollard was a symbol of courage. Not the kind that comes from lowering your shoulder into a linebacker. The kind that comes from walking into a room where no one wants you there, and winning anyway. Because Fritz Pollard wasn't just a great football player. He was a pioneer, a trailblazer, and the first black head coach in the history of the NFL. Born in 1894 in Chicago, Frederick Douglass Fritz Pollard grew up in a time when opportunities for African Americans in sports and in life were severely limited. Pollard's family valued education, and he attended Lane Tech High School, excelling in track, baseball, and football. He went on to Brown University, where he played halfback and became one of the most electric players in the country. At Brown, Pollard wasn't just good, he was unstoppable. In 1916, he led his team to the Rose Bowl, becoming the first African American to play in that game. His speed, agility, and field vision made him a nightmare for defenses. But his journey was never easy. Pollard faced open hostility on and off the field. Opposing players targeted him with cheap shots. Fans hurled racial slurs from the stands. Hotels and restaurants often refused him service during road trips. But Pollard didn't just endure, he excelled. And he did it with a confidence that let everyone know he belonged. In 1920, Pollard joined the Akron Pros of the newly formed American Professional Football Association, which would soon become the NFL. That first season, he led the Pros to the league's very first championship, becoming one of the earliest stars of pro football. He was fast, elusive, and intelligent, able to read defenses and break games open with a single play. But Pollard's impact went beyond the field. In 1921, while still playing, he was named co-head coach of the Akron Pros, making him the first black head coach in NFL history. It was a groundbreaking moment, but one that came with enormous challenges. The league at the time was overwhelmingly white, and many coaches and owners didn't believe a black man could lead a team. Pollard proved them wrong, guiding Akron through competitive seasons while still being one of the league's best halfbacks. Yet, despite his success, Pollard's career in the NFL was short-lived. By the mid-1920s, as racial attitudes hardened, black players began disappearing from the league. By 1934, the NFL had an unofficial ban on black players that would last until 1946. Pollard was forced out of the NFL, but he didn't stop breaking barriers. After leaving the league, Pollard organized and coached all-black barnstorming teams, like the Chicago Blackhawks, that traveled the country playing against semi-pro and independent squads. These games weren't just about competition. They were about opportunity. Pollard gave countless black athletes a chance to play high-level football when the NFL shut its doors to them. He also became a successful businessman, running a talent agency, a newspaper, and even working in the film industry. Pollard was more than an athlete. He was an entrepreneur, a visionary who refused to be defined or limited by the prejudice of his time. Pollard's legacy is massive, even if it took decades for the NFL to fully acknowledge it. In 2005, more than 80 years after he coached in the league, Fritz Pollard was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Today, the Fritz Pollard Alliance works to promote diversity and equal opportunity in NFL coaching and front office positions. His name lives on, not just as a football pioneer, but as a champion for inclusion. In the context of the NFL survival story, Pollard's contribution is critical. He proved, at a time when the league was still in its infancy, that talent knows no color. That leadership isn't defined by race, and that the game could be richer, better, and more exciting when the best players, all the best players, are allowed on the field. Fritz Pollard's journey wasn't about just surviving the game, it was about surviving the world around it. And in doing so, he opened a door that others would eventually walk through, even if that door slammed shut for decades after him. In the next segment, we are going to shift from coaching and trailblazing to one of the most revolutionary offensive players in NFL history, Don Hutson. He wasn't just a great receiver, he invented the modern wide receiver position. It's the roots, the separation, the idea that passing could be an art form. All of it traces back to him. And without Hutson, the passing game we see today might not exist. Stay tuned. Before the 1930s, football was a ground game. Coaches loved to run the ball, control the clock, and grind out wins. Passing, that was risky. Unreliable, more likely to end in an interception than a touchdown. Then Don Hutson showed up and rewrote the rules of offense forever. Donald Montgomery Hutson was born in 1913 in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. At first glance, he didn't look like a football star. He was tall and lean, around 6'1" and 180 pounds, more like a sprinter than a bruising back. And in a way, that's exactly what he was. Hutson had blazing speed for the era. On the track, he could run the 100-yard dash in just over 10 seconds. On the football field, that speed was deadly. Hutson attended the University of Alabama, where he played end, the old term for what we'd now call a wide receiver. Back then, ends were mostly blockers who occasionally caught short passes, but Hutson had a knack for getting open deep, and he had a teammate who could find him, a young quarterback named Riley Smith, in the 1935 Rose Bowl. Hutson's speed was on full display. On the very first play from scrimmage, he caught a long touchdown pass and never looked back. Alabama won the game, and scouts took notice of the skinny kid who could run past anyone. That summer, the Green Bay Packers signed Hutson, and his arrival would change the NFL forever. In his very first professional play from scrimmage, he caught an 83-yard touchdown pass from Packers quarterback Arnie Herber. It was a sign of things to come. Hutson didn't just run routes, he invented them. Before him, most pass patterns were basic: run straight, cut left or right. Hutson experimented with fakes, sudden breaks, and angled routes that confused defenders. He could make a defender think he was going long, then stop on a dime for a short catch. Or he'd sell a short route before blowing past them for a deep ball. Defenders had never seen anything like it, and most of them simply couldn't keep up. From 1935 to 1945, Hutson was the offensive weapon in the NFL. He led the league in receptions 8 times, in receiving yards 7 times, and in touchdown catches 9 times, all still records for consecutive seasons. In 1942, he had a season so outrageous it still sounds made up: 74 catches, 1,211 yards, and 17 touchdowns in an 11-game season. Those numbers were decades ahead of their time. For comparison, most teams back then didn't throw for 1,200 yards total. Hutson did it almost single-handedly. But it wasn't just the stats. It was the way he forced defenses to evolve. Before Hutson, teams often played man-to-man coverage on ends, with little help over the top. Hutson's dominance forced coaches to start using double coverage, an early version of what we now call bracket defense. In other words, the game had to adapt to him. And remember, this was still the era of the Ironman. Hutson didn't just play offense. He also played defensive back, where he intercepted 30 passes in his career, and he handled place-kicking duties. In 1943, he scored 138 points in a single season, a record that stood for nearly 50 years. He did it by catching 11 touchdown passes, making 33 extra points, and kicking 3 field goals. Hutson's influence extended beyond the field. Fans loved him because he was different. In a league full of bruisers, Hutson was a technician. Watching him run a route was like watching a magician work. He made it look easy, but it was his precision, discipline, and timing that made him unstoppable. Kids began pretending to be Don Hutson in Sandlot games, just like they did with Red Grange a decade earlier. And suddenly, young players didn't just dream of being a quarterback or a fullback. They wanted to be the guy catching the passes. Even Packers coach Curly Lambeau admitted that Hutson changed his playbook. With Hutson on the field, Lambeau called more pass plays, more deep shots, more creative designs. In that way, Hutson didn't just change defenses, he changed offenses, too. He proved that passing could be a primary weapon, not just a trick. His career spanned 11 seasons, all with Green Bay, and during that time, Packers won 3 NFL championships. Hutson was named league MVP twice in 1941 and 1942, and was a first-team All-Pro 8 times. When he retired in 1945, he held virtually every significant receiving record. And here's the kicker: some of those records stood for more than 40 years. Hutson's impact on the NFL is hard to overstate. Without him, the passing game might have taken decades longer to develop into the high-flying attacks we see today. Modern greats like Jerry Rice, Randy Moss, and Larry Fitzgerald all operate in a world Hutson helped create. Even the routes we take for granted now, slants, posts, outs, curls, were refined and perfected by Hutson's mind and feet. In 1963, Don Hutson was part of the inaugural class of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. The Packers later named their indoor practice facility the Don Hutson Center, a tribute to the man who changed the way football is played. And here's a stat that still blows people away. For his career, Hutson averaged 16.4 yards per catch and scored a touchdown on nearly 1 out of every 5 receptions. That's efficiency at a level modern players can only dream about. In the grand story of the NFL's survival in the 1930s and 40s, Hutson's role was more than just winning games. He made football exciting. He made it unpredictable. He gave fans a reason to show up, not just for the team, but for the spectacle of watching one man dominate a game. If Fritz Pollard broke barriers and Clarke Hinkle embodied grit, Don Hutson showed the NFL what skill and innovation could do. In the next segment, we are going to look at another Ironman of the game, a player who might not have had Hutson's flash but had unmatched durability and leadership. Mel Eng. He played every snap, every game for 15 straight seasons, a feat no one has matched since. And his story shows just how much endurance mattered in an era before substitutions. Stay tuned. If Don Hutson was the NFL's offensive genius, then Mel Eng was its immovable anchor. He didn't have Hutson's highlight reel catches or Fritz Pollard's groundbreaking headlines. But without players like Mel Eng, the NFL's early years might have fallen apart in the trenches. Because Eng wasn't just a great player, he was always there, every snap, every game, every season. In an era where injuries were common and substitutions were rare, Mel Eng was the definition of reliability. They didn't call him the Ironman for nothing. Melvin Jack Eng was born in 1909 in Redding, California, and grew up in the Pacific Northwest. At Washington State College, he was a standout on both sides of the ball. Back then, everyone played offense and defense, and Eng excelled at both. When he graduated in 1931, professional football wasn't exactly the dream destination for top college players. The NFL was still fighting for survival. Salaries were low, and the game was rougher than most were willing to risk. But Eng took the leap, signing with the New York Giants. It would turn out to be one of the best signings in the franchise's history. From his rookie year in 1931 until his retirement in 1945, Mel Eng never missed a single game. Let that sink in. 15 straight seasons in one of the most physically punishing sports on earth without sitting out once. And this wasn't just standing on the sidelines. Eng played every snap. As a center, he anchored the offensive line, snapping the ball, reading defenses, and protecting his quarterback. On defense, he played linebacker, diagnosing plays, making tackles, and often being the last line of defense. The most remarkable part: he played 60 minutes almost every Sunday. No breaks, no rotating out for a substitute, no load management. If the Giants were on the field, Eng was out there. In fact, during the 1938 season, the year he was named the NFL's most valuable player, and played every single minute of every single game, including the championship win over the Green Bay Packers. Yes, you heard that right. A center won the NFL MVP. That's how dominant and valuable he was. Eng wasn't flashy. He didn't have gaudy stats because linemen didn't get stats. What he had was respect, from teammates, opponents, coaches, and fans. Giants head coach Steve Owen once said, "Mel could play forever. He was the best center I ever saw, and maybe the smartest player who ever lived." His intelligence was one of his greatest assets. Eng could read the opposing defense and adjust blocking assignments on the fly. On defense, he could sniff out a play before the ball was even snapped. One of Hein's most famous traits was his grip. When he snapped the ball, he did it with such precision that his quarterback could take it without looking. And when he locked onto a defender, it was like being caught in a steel vise. Opponents swore his hands were made of iron, but his endurance was almost superhuman. Remember, this was before modern protective gear, before advanced medical treatment, before concussion protocol was even an idea. Players were expected to walk off their injuries, and the game was brutal. Yet Eng stayed healthy enough and tough enough to go the distance season after season. Hein's leadership was another reason he was indispensable. He wasn't a loud, fiery captain. He led by example, showing up prepared, playing hard, and never letting his teammates down. When things got tough, the Giants could look at Hein and know he'd be steady, focused, and ready to push through. The Giants were one of the league's most successful teams during Hein's tenure, reaching the NFL championship game 8 times and winning twice in 1934 and 1938. He was named All-NFL in 11 of his 15 seasons. A level of consistency that is almost unheard of in football history. When he retired in 1945, Hein was the last player from the NFL's 1930s Ironman era, the last man to have played without ever leaving the field in a game. After his playing days, Hein stayed connected to football, coaching at both the college and professional levels. He spent time as an assistant coach with the Los Angeles Rams and later became the first commissioner of the Pacific Coast Conference, a predecessor to today's Pac-12. In 1963, Hein was part of the inaugural class of the Pro Football Hall of Fame, one of the first 17 men enshrined. It was a fitting honor for a player who embodied the toughness, skill, and commitment that defined the NFL's survival years. The New York Giants later retired his number 7 jersey, a rare tribute for an offensive lineman. Mel Hein's story is a reminder that the NFL wasn't built on stars alone. It was built on players who showed up, did their job, and kept the game alive through sheer determination. In an era when the league was still fragile, having a player like Hein was like having a foundation you knew wouldn't crack. He was on T, just the center of the Giants' line. He was the center of their identity. In the next segment, we're going to look at another legend from this era who, like Hein, played without fear and with unmatched determination. Bill Hewitt, the helmetless wonder. His refusal to wear a helmet was in T just an odd quirk. It became part of his legend, a symbol of old-school toughness and a time when the game was as raw as it gets. Stay tuned. In the NFL's early days, toughness wasn't just a trait, it was a requirement. Players faced brutal hits, muddy fields, and equipment that would make today's athletes shake their heads. But even in that rough-and-tumble era, there was one man who stood out for his sheer audacity. Bill Hewitt, the helmetless wonder. Born in 1909 in Bay City, Michigan, William Ernest Hewitt was never the biggest guy on the field. Standing at 5 feet 9 inches and weighing about 190 pounds, he wasn't the type to intimidate you just by walking into the huddle. But once the game started, he was everywhere, fast, relentless, and fearless. He played his college ball at the University of Michigan, where his quickness and all-around ability made him a standout. Hewitt wasn't just a receiver. He could run, block, and play defense. And that versatility caught the attention of the Chicago Bears, who signed him in 1932. From the moment he stepped onto the field, Hewitt was different. Most players, even in the early 1930s, wore leather helmets for some protection. Not Hewitt. He refused to wear one. He claimed it restricted his vision and slowed him down. Instead, he went into every game with his head uncovered, hair flying, like some wild force of nature. It wasn't a gimmick, was just who he was. And it made him instantly recognizable to fans and terrifying to defenders. As an end, a position that combined the roles of modern wide receiver and tight end, Hewitt was one of the league's most dynamic offensive threats. In his rookie season, he helped the Bears win the NFL championship, catching passes from legendary quarterback Bronko Nagurski and forming a dangerous downfield connection. He had a knack for getting open deep, using quick cuts and bursts of speed that defenders struggled to match. But Hewitt was also a standout on defense. In those days, players went both ways, and Hewitt was just as comfortable making a tackle as he was catching a touchdown. He was aggressive, smart, and always seemed to be around the ball. His style was relentless. He played with a kind of intensity that didn't let up from the first whistle to the last. The helmetless look only added to his legend. Imagine being a defensive back in 1933, lining up against Hewitt. You know you're about to collide with a guy who doesn't even bother wearing head protection. You'd wonder, If he's not worried about his own head, what's he going to do to me? It was part psychological warfare, part personal preference, and all Bill Hewitt. His career took another leap when he was traded to the Philadelphia Eagles in 1937. The Eagles were still a struggling franchise, but Hewitt gave them instant credibility. Even without the championship-level supporting cast he had in Chicago, he continued to put up big plays and lead by example. One of the most notable things about Hewitt's career is his consistency. He was a two-time NFL champion with the Bears, a four-time A-Lon-FL selection, and known throughout the league for his work ethic. He was in T the type to take plays off. Even if the ball was in T coming his way, he was blocking, chasing, and making something happen. Hewitt's career came during a period of change in the NFL. The league was experimenting with new rules. The passing game was slowly growing, and the game itself was becoming more strategic. Players like Hewitt were perfect for that era, skilled enough to play multiple roles, tough enough to endure the grind, and memorable enough to draw fans. His refusal to wear a helmet eventually ended in 1939, when the NFL made helmets mandatory. By then, Hewitt's reputation was secure. The rule didn't change his playing style. He was still as fearless and fast as ever. But to fans, he'd always be the helmetless wonder, a throwback even in his own time. After retiring in 1939, Hewitt's contributions to the game weren't forgotten. In 1971, he was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Honored as one of the toughest and most versatile players of his generation. Sadly, Hewitt's life was cut short. He died in a car accident in 1947 at the age of just 37. But his legend, the image of him sprinting down the field, bareheaded, defying both convention and danger, has never faded. In the story of the NFL's survival, Hewitt represents something essential: the personalities that made fans care. Sure, championships and rivalries mattered, but individual figures, colorful, fearless, and unforgettable, gave the league its character. Bill Hewitt wasn't just a great player. He was a symbol of the game's wild early days, when toughness meant more than just physical strength. It meant daring to be different. In the next segment, we'll move from fearless to versatile, looking at Paddy Driscoll, the man who could do it all. Quarterback, halfback, kicker, coach. Driscoll was the NFL's Swiss Army knife, and his story shows how one player's adaptability could change the course of games. Stay tuned. In today's NFL, players are specialists. Quarterbacks throw, kickers kick, punters punt, wide receivers catch passes, linebackers tackle. But in the NFL's earliest days, the best players did everything, and few did more or did it better than Paddy Driscoll. John Leo Paddy Driscoll was born in 1895 in Evanston, Illinois. By the time he was a teenager, he was already making a name for himself in both football and baseball. He started at Northwestern University, where his quickness, intelligence, and versatility made him the heartbeat of the team. Driscoll was so talented that when he wasn't on the football field, he was playing professional baseball with the Chicago Cubs. But it was football where he would make his greatest mark. After college, Driscoll joined the Hammond Pros in 1919 and quickly proved himself as one of the league's most valuable all-around players. In 1920, the first year of what would become the NFL, he signed with the Chicago Cardinals, and that's where the legend truly began. Driscoll was officially listed as a quarterback, but that title didn't come close to capturing his role. On offense, he could throw accurate passes, run the ball with power, or kick field goals with deadly accuracy. On defense, he was a tough, instinctive back who could sniff out plays and make big tackles. On special teams, he returned punts and kickoffs, often breaking long runs that shifted the momentum of games. And when his team needed a punt, Driscoll would boom it himself. He wasn't just a jack of all trades. He was a master of them. In 1923, Driscoll led the league in scoring with 84 points. thanks to his unique combination of rushing touchdowns, passing touchdowns, field goals, and extra points. Remember, this was in an era when the season was just 12 games long. Driscoll's kicking was particularly deadly. Back then, the football was shaped differently, making long kicks much harder than they are today. But Driscoll was so accurate that opposing teams dreaded giving up field position. He also had a knack for clutch performances. In 1925, he famously outdueled the Great Red Grange in a Bears-Cardinals showdown, scoring all 10 of the Cardinals' points in a 10-0 win. And here's something that speaks to his stamina. Like most stars of his era, Driscoll played every minute of nearly every game. There were no timeouts for a breather, no rotating out to save energy. He'd quarterback the offense, then immediately line up on defense, and then trot back to return punts. Driscoll's leadership was as valuable as his athleticism. He was a fierce competitor who demanded the best from his teammates, and his football IQ was unmatched. He could read defenses, adjust plays on the fly, and exploit weaknesses long before film study was part of the game. After his playing career, Driscoll turned to coaching, first as head coach of the Chicago Cardinals and later as head coach of the Chicago Bears, where he succeeded the legendary George Halas in 1956. Though his coaching career was shorter than his playing days, his influence carried on. Many of his strategies, especially in special teams play, were adopted by other teams in the league. In 1965, Paddy Driscoll was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. The honor was long overdue. By then, he'd been retired for more than 3 decades. But his reputation as one of football's first true all-purpose stars had never faded. In the grand story of the NFL's survival in the 1920s and 30s, Driscoll's role was critical. He showed fans that one player could dominate in every phase of the game, in a league struggling to sell itself against the popularity of college football. Multi-talented stars like Driscoll gave paying customers a reason to come back week after week. Paddy Driscoll didn't just do it all. He did it all at a championship level. And in an era when the NFL couldn't afford to be boring, players like him kept the crowds talking, the turnstiles spinning, and the league alive. In the next segment, we'll turn to the sideline and focus on a man whose contributions to the NFL warranty just as a player, but as one of the most important builders of the game, George Halas. Halas wasn't just Papa Bear. He was a player, coach, owner, and promoter rolled into one. And without him, the NFL might not even exist today. Stay tuned. If the NFL had a family tree, its roots would be named George Halas, not because he was the league's first star, not because he was the richest owner, but because, without George Halas, the NFL might have died before it ever truly lived. George Stanley Halas was born in 1895 in Chicago, Illinois, the city that would forever be tied to his name. Growing up, he excelled in multiple sports, including football, baseball, and track. In fact, Halas was so athletic that he briefly played baseball for the New York Yankees in 1919. But his baseball career ended quickly, and fortunately for football, his true calling was waiting. In 1920, Halas became one of the founding members of the American Professional Football Association, which would become the NFL in 1922. He didn't just join the league. He bought a team, the Decatur Staleys. A year later, he moved the team to Chicago, renamed them the Chicago Bears, and began shaping them into one of the most iconic franchises in sports history. But Halas wasn't just an owner. He was a player, a hard-nosed end who could block, tackle, and catch passes. And he wasn't just a player. He was a coach, designing plays and organizing practices. Imagine that. In today's NFL, those roles are split among dozens of people. In 1920, George Halas was doing all of them at once. Halas was also a marketing genius before marketing was even a thing. He understood that for the NFL to survive, it had to attract fans away from college football, which was far more popular at the time. One of his smartest moves came in 1925, when he signed Red Grange, the galloping ghost, to the Bears right after Grange's college career ended. The decision caused a sensation. Crowds packed stadiums to see Grange, and in the process, they saw professional football as something worth paying for. Halas didn't just sell the game, he innovated it. As a coach, he was constantly tinkering with formations, strategies, and training methods. He helped popularize the T formation, which became one of the most effective offensive systems in football history. He demanded discipline, toughness, and precision from his players. If you played for Halas, you were expected to give everything, and if you didn't, you wouldn't last long. The results spoke for themselves. Under his leadership, the Chicago Bears became a powerhouse. Over his 40 seasons as head coach, yes, 40 seasons, Halas led the Bears to 6 NFL championships. His Bears teams were known for their ferocious defenses, punishing running games, and willingness to adapt to whatever would give them an edge. Halas wasn't without controversy. He was a fierce competitor, and some rivals accused him of being ruthless when it came to both football and business. But even his toughest critics admitted that his commitment to the game was unmatched. And here's the thing, Halas wasn't just building the Bears, he was building the NFL itself. In the league's early years, teams came and went constantly. Money was tight, travel was expensive. There were no massive TV contracts to keep franchises afloat. Halas worked tirelessly to keep the league together, often lending money, organizing schedules, and convincing owners not to fold. When the Great Depression hit in the 1930s, Halas doubled down, cutting costs but never cutting his belief that the NFL could grow into something bigger. Even during World War II, when rosters were decimated by military service, Halas found ways to keep the league running. He served in the U.S. Navy during the war, yet still managed to keep his Bears in contention for championships. After the war, the NFL entered a new era of growth, and Halas was right there at the center. He supported innovations like televised games, revenue sharing, and the NFL draft system, all ideas that helped create the competitive balance and financial stability the league needed to thrive. By the time Halas retired from coaching in 1967, his legacy was already secure. 318 wins, 6 championships, 4 decades of leadership, and a direct hand in transforming professional football from a niche attraction into America's most popular sport. In 1963, he was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame as part of its inaugural class. His name is still synonymous with the Bears. Their team headquarters is called Halas Hall in his honor. But perhaps Halas's greatest achievement wasn't any single championship or innovation. It was his ability to hold the league together when it could have easily fallen apart. In the fragile early years, it was leaders like Halas who kept the NFL alive long enough to become the giant it is today. He wasn't just Papa Bear to Chicago. He was the father of the NFL. In the next segment, we'll move from the man who built the league to one of its most unstoppable forces on the field, Bronko Nagurski. Nagurski wasn't just a player. He was a legend, a human bulldozer who could run through, over, and around anything in his path. His story is the stuff of football folklore, and his battles became must-see events in the NFL's survival era. Stay tuned. Some players are strong. Some players are fast. And then, there was Bronko Nagurski, the man who could make an entire defense look like a pile of dominoes. Born in 1908 in Rainy River, Ontario, Canada, Bronislaw Bronko Nagurski grew up in the rugged landscape of northern Minnesota. His family lived on a farm. And Bronko's strength wasn't built in a gym. It was built hauling logs, plowing fields, and doing the kind of back-breaking labor that shaped every muscle in his body. By the time he reached the University of Minnesota, Nagurski was a physical marvel. He stood 6 feet 2, weighed 235 pounds, enormous for his time, and could run with surprising speed. He was so big and powerful that opposing players swore hitting him was like colliding with a moving truck. Nagurski played both fullback and tackle for the Gophers, dominating on both sides of the ball. He could bulldoze defenders as a runner, pancake them as a blocker, and crush them as a tackler. His reputation grew so large that NFL scouts made special trips just to see him in action. In 1930, the Chicago Bears, led by George Halas, signed Nagurski, and it didn't take long for him to become the most feared player in the league. As a fullback, Nagurski's running style was pure destruction. He didn't dance around defenders. He didn't juke. He went straight through them. He had a low, punishing style. Knees high, shoulders square, head forward. Once he hit top speed, tackling him head-on was like trying to stop a runaway train. Legend has it that in one game against the Washington Redskins, Nagurski ran over so many defenders on his way to the end zone that he didn't T-stop until he slammed into the brick wall behind the goalpost. But Nagurski wasn't just brute force. He was versatile. Halas sometimes lined him up as a tackle on defense, where he was just as terrifying. Imagine running into him in the open field. Most players didn't want to imagine it. They just wanted to avoid it. The Bears of the 1930s were built around Nagurski's punishing style. They used him to wear down defenses, control the clock, and set the tone for the game. His presence alone made opponents play differently. Some defenders admitted they tried to fall the right way when tackling him to avoid serious injury. Nagurski helped lead the Bears to 3 NFL championships during his career: 1932, 1933, and 1943. In the legendary 1932 championship game, the NFL's first playoff, he was the difference maker, powering through a frozen indoor field to secure the win over the Portsmouth Spartans. And here's something that shows just how tough he was. Nagurski retired after the 1937 season to become a professional wrestler, and he was great at that too, winning multiple world titles. But when the Bears needed players during World War II, Halas called, and Nagurski returned in 1943. After 5 years away from football, he was 35 years old, heavier than before, and still ran through defenders like they were paper. That season, he helped the Bears win another NFL championship. Opponents and teammates alike told stories about Nagurski for decades. One lineman claimed tackling him felt like being hit by a car. Another said, if Bronko gets ahead of steam, the only smart move is to get out of his way. Even NFL films later ranked him among the toughest players in football history. Bronko's career stats might not look gaudy by modern standards. The NFL of his era was a different game, with fewer plays and lower scores. But his impact was immeasurable. He was the kind of player who could single-handedly change the outcome of a game. In 1963, Nagurski was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame as part of its inaugural class, one of the first 17 players honored. His legacy wasn't just about championships or personal records. It was about the fear he struck in opponents and the pride he brought to his team. Even today, his name carries weight. The University of Minnesota's football complex includes the Bronko Nagurski practice facility, and the Bronko Nagurski Trophy is awarded annually to the best defensive player in college football. In the story of the NFL's survival, Nagurski's role was simple but essential. He gave the league a mythic figure, a Paul Bunyan in pads. A player who seemed larger than life, because in many ways he was. For a sport trying to prove itself to fans, having a figure like Bronko Nagurski made the NFL worth watching. People came to see him run, to see defenders bounce off him, to see what impossible feat he'd pull off next. In the next segment, we're going to move from raw power to pure strategy, looking at Dutch Clarke, the quarterback who brought the T formation to life and became one of the most cerebral players of his generation. Stay tuned. If Bronko Nagurski was the NFL's unstoppable force, then Dutch Clarke was its master tactician, a quarterback who could beat you with his arm, his legs, and his mind. Earl Dutch Clarke was born in 1906 in Fowler, Colorado. A small-town kid with a big, competitive streak, Clarke didn't grow up in a football hotbed. But his natural athleticism made him a standout in every sport he tried: football, basketball, baseball, even track. At Colorado College, Clarke was a sensation. He played quarterback, halfback, kicker, and safety, dominating in all phases of the game. In an era when the quarterback wasn't just a passer, but often the team's best runner, Clarke fit the role perfectly. By the time he graduated in 1930, he was considered one of the best all-around players in the country. Clarke joined the Portsmouth Spartans, a small-market NFL team in Ohio. In 1931, it immediately became the heart of the franchise. The Spartans didn't have the resources of bigger teams like the Bears or Giants. But with Clarke under center, they became dangerous. He had a quick release, a strong and accurate arm for the time, and a deceptive running style that left defenders grasping at air. But Clarke wasn't just about physical skill. He was a thinker, a strategist. He could read defenses, call plays on the fly, and find weaknesses others couldn't see. One of his greatest contributions came when he helped popularize the T formation, an offensive setup that would later revolutionize football. The T formation allowed for a faster, more deceptive offense, with misdirection plays and quicker passes. Clarke's ability to run it effectively helped set the stage for its dominance in the 1940s. In 1932, Clarke led the Spartans to the NFL's first-ever playoff game, the now famous 1932 NFL Championship against the Chicago Bears. The game was played indoors at Chicago Stadium because of extreme cold and snow, and the field was just 80 yards long. The cramped space and strange conditions made it one of the most unusual games in NFL history. The Spartans lost 9-0, but Clarke's poise and adaptability in such bizarre circumstances added to his legend. When the Portsmouth Spartans moved to Detroit in 1934, becoming the Detroit Lions, Clarke remained the team's centerpiece. That same year, he led the Lions to the NFL championship, cementing his place as one of the game's elite quarterbacks. Clarke's style was thrilling to watch. He could drop back to pass, then take off running if the defense gave him an opening. He had a knack for turning broken plays into big gains, and he wasn't afraid to lower his shoulder to finish a run. Defenses had to account for him on every play, not just as a passer or runner, but also as a kicker. Clarke was one of the most accurate place kickers of his time, often providing the crucial points in low-scoring games. Over his career, Clarke was named All-N-F 6 times and led the league in scoring 3 times. He was the NFL's leading scorer in both 1932 and 1935. A testament to his all-around value, he also had an uncanny ability to come through in big moments. Teammates said that in the huddle, Clarke was calm and confident, never rattled, no matter how tight the game was. Clarke's impact went beyond the stat sheet. He was one of the league's first truly marketable quarterbacks. A player who could draw fans and headlines in an era when the NFL needed stars to survive. And while his career numbers may not match modern QBs, thanks to shorter seasons and different rules, his influence on the position is undeniable. He helped prove that the quarterback could be the brain of the offense, not just another backfield runner. After retiring as a player, Clarke moved into coaching, leading the Lions and later the Cleveland Rams. His understanding of strategy and fundamentals made him a respected figure on the sideline, though his coaching career never matched the heights of his playing days. In 1963, Dutch Clarke was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame as part of its inaugural class. Today, his name lives on in Colorado, where his hometown stadium is named in his honor. Dutch Clarke's story is a reminder that the NFL's survival wasn't just about brute strength. It was also about innovation. His role in bringing the T formation to life and redefining what a quarterback could be helped shape the modern game. In the next segment, we'll look at another quarterback who pushed the limits of the position, Norm Van Brocklin. The man with the rocket arm who won 2 NFL titles and still holds one of the league's most unbreakable records. Stay tuned. Some quarterbacks manage the game. Some quarterbacks make safe throws, avoid mistakes, and hope their defense carries them to victory. And then there was Norm van Brocklin, the Dutchman, who believed that if you had a cannon for an arm, you used it. Norman Mac van Brocklin was born in 1926 in Parade, South Dakota, but grew up in Walnut Creek, California. His early years were shaped by the Great Depression and World War II. He served in the Navy as a teenager before enrolling at the University of Oregon, where he quickly made a name for himself as one of the most dangerous passers in college football. In 1949, Van Brocklin was drafted by the Los Angeles Rams, a team that already had a star quarterback in Bob Waterfield. At first glance, it seemed like a strange fit. Why draft another QB when you already had one of the league's best? But Rams head coach Clarke saw something special in Van Brocklin. He knew this was a player who could stretch the field like no one else. In an era when passing was still considered risky and defenses ruled the game, Van Brocklin could launch the ball 60 yards in the air and put it right where he wanted it. At 6'1" and 190 pounds, Van Brocklin didn't have the imposing size of some of today's quarterbacks. But he had incredible footwork, a lightning release, and a deep ball that could break a defense's spirit. In his rookie year, he split time with Waterfield, but by 1950, Van Brocklin was making history. That season, he set a record that still stands more than 70 years later: 554 passing yards in a single game. Think about that. In an era when most teams barely threw the ball 20 times a game, Van Brocklin unleashed an aerial assault that has never been matched. Van Brocklin's Rams were one of the most explosive teams of the early 1950s, surrounded by weapons. Like Elroy Kraslegs, Hirsch, and Tom Fears, he turned the Rams' offense into a nightmare for defenses. In 1951, he led Los Angeles to an NFL championship, throwing a 73-yard game-winning touchdown pass to Fears in the fourth quarter. It was the Rams' first and only championship in Los Angeles until decades later. But Van Brocklin wasn't done making history. In 1958, he was traded to the Philadelphia Eagles, a franchise that hadn't won a title in nearly a decade. Many thought his best years were behind him. Instead, Van Brocklin became the heart and soul of the Eagles' offense, bringing his fiery leadership and deep passing style to a team desperate for an identity. His defining moment came in the 1960 NFL championship game, facing the Green Bay Packers, coached by Vince Lombardi and loaded with Hall of Fame talent. Van Brocklin orchestrated one of the greatest upsets in NFL history. He used his experience and quick decision-making to outsmart Lombardi's defense, controlling the game's tempo and making clutch throws when it mattered most. The Eagles won 17-13, handing Lombardi the only playoff loss of his coaching career. That championship was Van Brocklin's swan song. He retired immediately after the game, going out on top. Over his 12-year career, he was a 9-time Pro Bowler, 2-time NFL champion, and led the league in passing 3 times. But beyond the stats and titles, Van Brocklin was respected and sometimes feared for his competitive fire. Teammates admired his toughness. He was on tee afraid to stand in the pocket and take a hit, if it meant completing a pass. Opponents knew he wouldn't back down from a challenge. Coaches loved his football IQ, though some found his strong personality hard to manage. After retiring as a player, Van Brocklin became a head coach for the Minnesota Vikings and later the Atlanta Falcons. While his coaching career didn't bring the same level of success as his playing days, he remained a respected figure in the game for decades. In 1971, Norm Van Brocklin was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, cementing his place among the all-time great quarterbacks. Van Brocklin's story is a reminder that the NFL's history isn't just about survival. It's about evolution. He represented the shift from a league dominated by grinding run games to one where the forward pass could change everything. In a time when throwing deep was considered risky, Van Brocklin made it an art form. His willingness to push the limits of the passing game not only won championships, it helped shape the modern NFL offense. In the next segment, we'll turn to another two-way legend, Jim Thorpe. The original gridiron Superman whose talent and fame gave the NFL credibility when it needed it most. Stay tuned. When you talk about the most naturally gifted athletes in history, not just in football, but in any sport, one name towers above the rest: Jim Thorpe. Born in 1887 near Prague, Oklahoma, Thorpe was a member of the Sac and Fox Nation, and from the very beginning, his life was shaped by both hardship and extraordinary talent. He grew up hunting, fishing, and working the land, building strength, speed, and endurance before he ever saw a formal playing field. Thorpe's athletic gifts revealed themselves early. He could run faster, jump higher, and throw farther than just about anyone around him. But his road wasn't easy. He faced loss, poverty, and discrimination, yet each setback seemed to make him stronger. Thorpe first rose to national fame at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School under legendary coach Pop Warner. There, he played football with a style that was years ahead of its time, combining breakaway speed with punishing power. In 1911 and 1912, he led Carlisle to victories over the best college teams in the nation, humiliating traditional powers with his skill and versatility. He could run, pass, punt, kick field goals, and tackle like a linebacker. He was the definition of a complete player. But football was just one arena where Thorpe dominated. In the 1912 Stockholm Olympics, he won gold medals in both the decathlon and pentathlon, proving himself the world's greatest all-round athlete. His Olympic performance was so dominant that Sweden's King Gustav V famously told him, "You, sir, are the greatest athlete in the world." Thorpe simply replied, "Thanks, King." After the Olympics, Thorpe entered professional sports, and not just football. He played Major League Baseball for the New York Giants and other teams, all while playing professional football in the off-seasons. When the NFL was founded in 1920, then known as the American Professional Football Association, Jim Thorpe was chosen as its first president. That decision wasn't just symbolic. Thorpe's name carried enormous weight. He was a household name, a hero to sports fans across the country. Having him as the face of the new league gave it instant credibility in a sports world dominated by baseball and college football. Thorpe played for several teams in the NFL's early years, including the Canton Bulldogs, Orang Indians, and Rock Island Independents. As a running back, defensive back, kicker, and occasional quarterback, he could do it all. Fans came to see him specifically. Stadiums filled not just for the game, but for the chance to see Jim Thorpe in action, to see the man who could change a game in a single play. His running style was a combination of speed and grace. He wasn't the biggest player on the field, but his vision and balance made him nearly impossible to bring down. He could break through tackles, change direction without losing speed, and accelerate past defenders in the blink of an eye. On defense, he was just as dangerous, reading plays, making big hits, and intercepting passes. And when the team needed points, he'd step up to kick field goals or extra points. But Thorpe's life after football wasn't the fairy tale you might expect. Despite his fame, he never earned the kind of money modern athletes make. Contracts were small, and players often had to work off-season jobs just to make ends meet. Thorpe also faced systemic racism and the lingering effects of losing his Olympic medals in 1913, which were controversially stripped because he had played semi-professional baseball before the games. The decision haunted him for decades. After his playing days ended, Thorpe worked a variety of jobs: construction worker, security guard, even bit parts in Hollywood films. But financial struggles followed him throughout his life. Yet his impact on the NFL and American sports can't be overstated. Without Thorpe's star power in those early years, professional football might never have gained enough attention to survive. He was one of the first athletes whose presence could single-handedly sell tickets, and his versatility remains unmatched. Few, if any, players have ever been elite at so many different skills across so many sports at the highest level. In 1963, Thorpe was part of the inaugural class inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and in 1982, long after his death, the International Olympic Committee finally restored his gold medals, acknowledging the injustice that had been done. Today, his name is immortalized in awards, stadiums, and history books, not just as a great football player, but as one of the greatest athletes of all time. In the NFL's story of survival through the 1920s and 30s, Jim Thorpe's role was foundational. He didn't just play in the league. He was the league's identity in those early days. His fame drew crowds. His talent inspired teammates. His legend gave the NFL a fighting chance in its infancy. In the next segment, we'll turn to another quarterback who carried his own brand of toughness and brilliance. Otto Graham, the original prototype for the modern quarterback who dominated the game in the 1940s and 50s with an unmatched winning record. Stay tuned. In the history of professional football, there have been quarterbacks who were talented, quarterbacks who were winners, and quarterbacks who changed the game. But only a handful have done all three at the highest level, and among them, Otto Graham stands as a giant. Otto Everett Graham Jr. was born in 1921 in Waukegan, Illinois. He was a gifted all-around athlete, excelling in basketball, baseball, and football from a young age. In fact, football wasn't even his first love. He was a standout basketball player at Northwestern University and even played professionally for the Rochester Royals in the National Basketball League before the NFL came calling. It was Paul Brown, the visionary coach of the Cleveland Browns, who saw Graham's potential to be something special under center. When Graham joined the Browns in 1946, back when they were part of the All-America Football Conference, AAFC, he stepped into a team loaded with talent but in need of a leader. And that's exactly what he became. From the very beginning, Graham had that rare combination of arm strength, accuracy, and decision-making. But what truly set him apart was his poise. He never seemed rattled, no matter how big the moment. In his very first season, Graham led the Browns to an AAFC championship. And he didn't stop there. From 1946 to 1949, the Browns won 4 straight AAFC titles, a level of dominance rarely seen in professional sports. When the Browns joined the NFL in 1950, skeptics wondered if Graham and his team could replicate that success against tougher competition. Graham answered that question immediately. In his first NFL season, he led the Browns to the 1950 NFL Championship, defeating the Los Angeles Rams in a thrilling 30-28 victory. Over the next 9 seasons, Graham would lead Cleveland to the championship game every single year he played. Think about that. In 10 seasons, he reached the title game 10 times. And he won 7 championships. Graham's playing style was deceptively modern for his era. He wasn't just a pocket passer. He could scramble, improvise, and make plays with his legs when needed. His ability to read defenses and adjust on the fly made him one of the most dangerous quarterbacks of his time. Statistically, he was remarkable. He led the league in passing yards twice, passing touchdowns twice, and passer rating 5 times. In 1953, he posted a passer rating of 99.7, unheard of in the run-heavy game of the 1950s. And yet, Graham was as tough as they came. In an era before modern protective equipment, he took hits that would sideline most players today, and he kept getting back up. His teammates respected him not just for his talent, but for his resilience. Paul Brown designed his offenses around Graham's skills, incorporating timing routes, precision passing, and innovative play calling that would influence NFL offenses for decades. Graham was the perfect general to execute Brown's vision. One of Graham's most legendary performances came in the 1954 NFL Championship game. When the Browns demolished the Detroit Lions 56-10, Graham threw for 3 touchdowns and ran for 3 more, single-handedly dismantling one of the best defenses in football. That game showcased everything that made him special: leadership, accuracy, versatility, and a knack for showing up big when it mattered most. After the 1955 season, Graham retired at the top of his game. Having just led the Browns to yet another championship, his final record as a starting quarterback: 105 wins, 17 losses, 4 ties, a winning percentage of .810, the best in NFL history for quarterbacks with at least 50 starts. Graham's legacy goes beyond the numbers and titles. He was, in many ways, the blueprint for the modern quarterback, combining physical talent with mental sharpness and blending passing ability with leadership. In 1965, he was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, a fitting tribute to a player who redefined excellence at his position. In the larger story of the NFL's survival and growth, Otto Graham represented the league's arrival into an era of sophistication. He was proof that professional football could be not just tough and physical, but also precise, strategic, and beautiful to watch. He was just winning games. He was helping to shape the very identity of the NFL. In the next segment, we'll close this chapter with one final legend: Red Grange, the Galloping Ghost, whose fame brought professional football into the national spotlight and made the NFL impossible to ignore. Stay tuned. Some players change games. Some players change seasons. But every so often, a player comes along who changes an entire sport. For professional football in the 1920s, that player was Harold Red Grange, the Galloping Ghost. Grange was born in 1903 in Forksville, Pennsylvania, but moved with his family to Wheaton, Illinois, at a young age. His father was the town's police chief, and young Harold grew up playing every sport he could, but football became his obsession. At Wheaton High School, he was a multi-sport star. But it was his breakaway speed on the football field that caught the attention of college recruiters. His next stop would be the University of Illinois, and it was there that Red Grange would become a national sensation. In 1924, during a game against powerhouse Michigan, Grange delivered one of the greatest single-game performances in college football history. He scored 4 touchdowns in the first 12 minutes, added 2 more later in the game, and racked up nearly 400 total yards. Sports writers compared him to a ghost, gliding past defenders so effortlessly they barely touched him. The nickname Galloping Ghost was born. Grange's fame grew beyond football. He appeared in magazines, on the radio, and in early newsreels. In an era when college football was far more popular than the fledgling NFL, he was the sport's first true celebrity. And that's where George Halas saw an opportunity. In 1925, just days after Grange's final college game, Halas signed him to the Chicago Bears. It was a move that shocked the sports world. The most famous college football player in the country was turning professional. To maximize the impact, Halas scheduled a grueling barnstorming tour for the Bears. Over the course of just a few weeks, the team played multiple games a week across the country, drawing massive crowds everywhere they went. In New York, 73,000 fans packed the Polo Grounds to watch Grange play. At a time when NFL games often drew fewer than 5,000. In Philadelphia, 65,000 showed up. In Los Angeles, another huge crowd turned out. It wasn't just the numbers, it was the spectacle. Fans came to see if the Galloping Ghost could dominate at the professional level the same way he had in college. And for the most part, he did. Grange's running style was electric. He didn't bulldoze defenders like Bronko Nagurski. He made them miss. He had an uncanny ability to change direction without slowing down, slipping through holes that didn't seem to exist a second earlier. His presence alone legitimized the NFL in the eyes of millions of sports fans, who had previously dismissed it as a second-rate version of college ball. But his career wasn't without challenges. The barnstorming tour took a physical toll, and Grange suffered a severe knee injury in 1927 that kept him out for an entire season. In an era before modern sports medicine, that kind of injury could end a career. Grange, however, fought his way back. While he never quite regained his college-level explosiveness, He reinvented himself as a versatile halfback, and later as a defensive back, contributing in all phases of the game. By the time he retired in 1934, Grange had won 2 NFL championships with the Bears, 1932 and 1933, and had been named All-Pro multiple times. Off the field, he worked as a broadcaster, helping to bring the game into living rooms across America. His voice and name carried the same credibility for the NFL as his legs once had. Grange's legacy isn't just about stats or titles, it's about impact. Before him, the NFL was a struggling league, fighting for survival. After him, it was on its way to becoming a national institution. He proved that professional football could attract the best players, draw massive crowds, and capture the nation's imagination. When the Pro Football Hall of Fame opened in 1963, Red Grange was, of course, part of its inaugural class. Today, his bronze bust stands as a reminder that without him, the NFL might not have survived those fragile early years. So, in the story of why the NFL didn't die in the 1930s, Red Grange is perhaps the single most important figure. He was the bridge between college fame and professional legitimacy, the spark that helped the league push through its toughest era. And with that, we close this chapter of NFL survival. From Halas to Nagurski, from Dutch Clarke to Jim Thorpe, from Otto Graham to the galloping ghost himself. These were the men who kept the game alive when the odds were stacked against it. In the next segment, we'll tie all of these stories together, showing exactly how these legends, with their grit, vision, and sheer willpower, carried the NFL through its darkest years and set the stage for the sport we know today. Stay with me, because this ending will connect every thread we've woven so far. And there it is, minus 25 chapters, each one a thread in the fabric of the NFL's survival story. We've walked through the frozen fields of Green Bay when the franchise nearly went bankrupt, and we stood on the sideline with George Halas as he juggled roles no single man should have been able to handle. We've felt the ground shake under Bronko Nagurski's running stride, watched Dutch Clarke dissect defenses with chessboard precision, and seen Don Hutson turn football into an aerial game decades ahead of its time. We've remembered Jim Thorpe's unmatched athletic dominance, Mel Hein's Ironman durability, Otto Graham's unmatched record, and the fearless creativity of innovators like Fritz Pollard, the first black head coach in NFL history. And then there was Red Grange, the man whose decision to go pro changed the fate of the league forever. He didn't just bring fans, he brought legitimacy. Before him, the NFL was a niche interest. After him, it was a real contender in the American sports landscape. What's remarkable is that none of these men played for the kind of money, fame, or comfort modern players enjoy. They played for love of the game, or sometimes just for enough cash to make it through the week. They played hurt. They played cold. They played when the league's future was hanging by a thread. The NFL had died in those years. If these players, coaches, and owners had walked away, professional football might have been nothing more than a curious footnote in sports history. But it didn't die. It adapted, it evolved, it survived. And today, when you see 70,000 fans packed into a state-of-the-art stadium, or watch a quarterback throw a perfect spiral on national TV, you're looking at the legacy of those who refused to let the league fade away. They were more than athletes. They were the NFL's lifeline. So the next time you hear a story about a star quarterback signing a $200 million contract or see a player hoist the Lombardi Trophy under confetti and fireworks, remember this: there was a time when professional football could barely afford the footballs. It survived because of the people we've just talked about, and it's still here because they built something strong enough to last. That's why their stories matter. Not just for history buffs, not just for die-hard fans, but for anyone who believes in fighting for something when the odds are against you. This has been the untold story of how the NFL refused to die in its earliest years, and the legends who made sure of it. Now, it's your turn. Which of these players do you think had the biggest impact on keeping the NFL alive? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's start the conversation. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the league's past, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more stories the history books forgot. Because, trust me, we're just getting started.